Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadowy halls of medieval churches where love becomes law, and passion bends to the iron will of ancient tradition. You can almost hear the heavy wooden doors creaking shut behind nervous couples as they enter a world where marriage isn't about hearts fluttering or stolen kisses under moonlight, but about contracts written in Latin, dowries counted in silver coins, and rules so complex they'd make modern tax codes seem like children's bedtime stories. The stone walls echo with whispered prayers and the rustling of parchment as scribes record unions that will bind souls not just until death, but according to the Church, for all eternity. Picture yourself walking through a medieval village on a crisp autumn morning, and you notice something peculiar. The baker's daughter, barely 14, is being fitted for a wedding dress while her intended groom, a merchant twice her age, negotiates with her father over the price of flower futures. Meanwhile, the local lord's son paces anxiously outside the church, knowing that his secret vows exchanged with the miller's daughter last spring might just cost him his inheritance. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for about why weddings today still involve so many strange rituals and why family approval still matters so much. Even in our supposedly liberated age, you're about to discover a time when getting married was less like planning a romantic celebration and more like navigating a legal minefield where one wrong step could damn your soul, bankrupt your family, or start a war between kingdoms. These weren't just quaint old customs that people followed out of habit. These were life and death regulations backed by the full power of the Church, which controlled not just what happened in this world, but what awaited you in the next. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. I'd love to know where and when you started watching this video, or perhaps you could share a compliment about which part of medieval history fascinates you most. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible, turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported to the year 1200, watching as the Catholic Church tightens its grip on one of humanity's most fundamental institutions. For centuries before this moment, marriage had been a relatively simple affair. Families arranged unions, couples exchanged vows, and communities celebrated. But now, as you observe from the shadows of history, something revolutionary is happening. The Church is declaring that marriage isn't just a social contract or family arrangement, but a holy sacrament, as sacred as baptism or communion. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and you can sense the tension rippling through medieval society as old ways clash with new religious demands. Village elders who once presided over marriage ceremonies now find themselves pushed aside as black-robed priests assert their authority. The Church's reasoning seems logical enough. If God created the union between man and woman, then surely God's representatives on earth should control how that union comes to pass. You witness the gradual erosion of ancient traditions that had governed marriage for thousands of years. Germanic tribes had allowed trial marriages, where couples lived together for a year before making their union permanent. Celtic communities practiced hand fasting, temporary unions that could be dissolved if no children were born. Roman law had recognized different types of marriage with varying degrees of formality and permanence. All of these flexible arrangements now crumble under the Church's insistence on uniformity and permanence. The transition creates profound confusion across medieval Europe. You watch as elderly peasants scratch their heads, wondering why marriages that were perfectly valid under their grandfathers' customs now require expensive church ceremonies. Merchants find themselves trapped between local traditions and church demands, unsure which rules apply to their business arrangements disguised as marriages. Even kings struggle with the new requirements, discovering that political alliances cemented through traditional marriage customs might not hold up under ecclesiastical scrutiny. You witness Pope Alexander III issuing decree after decree, each one adding another layer of complexity to what was once straightforward. Marriage must be consensual, he declares, but then defines consent in ways that would puzzle modern minds. The union must be blessed by a priest, but only after bans are read publicly for 3 consecutive Sundays, giving anyone with objections time to speak up. Couples must exchange vows in the presence of witnesses, but those vows must follow precise Latin formulations that most peasants couldn't even pronounce, let alone understand. The most revolutionary change you observe is the Church's insistence that marriage creates an unbreakable bond. Unlike the old Germanic and Celtic traditions that allowed divorce under various circumstances, Christian marriage becomes permanent. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, echoes through every chapel and cathedral, sealing fates with words that carry more weight than chains. You watch as this new system creates unexpected consequences. Suddenly, proving the validity of a marriage becomes crucial for inheritance rights, legitimacy of children and political alliances. Marriage certificates, previously unknown, become precious documents guarded more carefully than gold. Bishops establish church courts specifically to handle matrimonial disputes, creating an entirely new branch of medieval law that will employ thousands of clerks, scribes, and canon lawyers for centuries to come. But the Church's control goes deeper than just ceremony and paperwork. You observe priests inserting themselves into the most intimate aspects of human relationships, dictating not just who can marry whom, but when couples can be intimate, what positions are acceptable, and even which days of the week are appropriate for marital relations. The bedroom, once a private domain, becomes subject to religious oversight through confession and penance. The economic implications of this transformation become clear as you observe medieval society adapting. Church weddings require fees for the priest's services, for the use of the building, for the blessing of rings, for the recording of documents. What was once a community celebration funded by families becomes a commercial transaction that enriches ecclesiastical coffers. Poor couples find themselves excluded from formal marriage, creating a 2-tiered system that will persist for centuries. Historians still argue whether this ecclesiastical takeover of marriage strengthened or weakened the institution, but you can see both effects playing out simultaneously. On one hand, the Church's emphasis on consent and the spiritual nature of marriage offered some protection to women who might otherwise be treated as mere property. On the other hand, the rigid rules created new forms of suffering for those trapped in loveless or abusive unions with no hope of escape. As you move deeper into this medieval world, you notice how the Church's marriage rules create a complex hierarchy of unions. At the top sit marriages blessed by bishops and grand cathedrals, involving nobility whose unions might reshape the political map of Europe. Below them are the merchants and craftsmen, whose weddings require parish priest approval and proper documentation. At the bottom are the peasants, whose marriages often remain informal despite church demands, simply because they lack the time and money for elaborate religious procedures. The transformation you're witnessing will echo through centuries, creating traditions and expectations that persist even today. The white wedding dress, the exchange of rings, the presence of clergy, and the formal vows. All these elements trace back to the medieval church's determination to sanctify and control human love. You're watching the birth of marriage as we know it, complete with all its contradictions, beauty, and bizarre complications. You step deeper into the medieval world where childhood and adulthood blur into a confusing twilight that would shock modern sensibilities. The morning mist clings to cobblestone streets as you witness a scene that captures the bewildering reality of medieval marriage age. A girl who still plays with wooden dolls being measured for a wedding gown, while across the village square, a boy barely old enough to shave negotiates his bride price with the confidence of a seasoned merchant. The concept of childhood as we understand it simply doesn't exist in this world, where economic necessity and family survival trump any notion of protecting innocence or allowing natural development. You discover that the church, despite its moral authority, sets surprisingly low minimum ages for marriage, 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But these weren't arbitrary numbers pulled from thin air. They reflected medieval understanding of when children reached sexual maturity, though this understanding was based more on economic pressure than biological knowledge. Canon lawyers justified these ages by pointing to biblical precedents and ancient Roman law, creating a legal framework that seems designed more to accommodate family financial needs than protect young people. The reality you observe on medieval streets tells a more complex story than the official rules suggest. While 12-year-old brides were legally permissible, most families waited until their daughters reached 15 or 16 before arranging marriages, not out of concern for the girl's well-being, but because older brides commanded higher dowries and were more likely to survive childbirth. You watch as parents calculate the optimal age for marrying off their children like farmers deciding when to harvest crops. Too early meant less value. Too late meant missed opportunities. But here's where medieval marriage age becomes truly bizarre. The concept of consent for children who were considered old enough to make lifelong commitments but too young to choose their own breakfast. You observe elaborate ceremonies where children solemnly repeat Latin vows they don't understand, binding themselves to strangers chosen by parents who might be motivated more by debt relief than their offspring's happiness. The church required verbal consent from both parties, but rarely questioned whether a terrified 12-year-old truly understood what she was agreeing to. You witness the strange ritual of child betrothals, where families promise their infants to each other in elaborate contracts that read like business mergers. These arrangements could be made when children were still in swaddling clothes, creating a medieval futures market in human beings. The church distinguished between betrothal and marriage, requiring couples to wait until they reached the minimum ages before actual consummation. But you see how these distinctions often blurred in practice. Some families held wedding ceremonies for betrothed children, treating them as fully married except for the physical aspects, creating a liminal state that lasted for years. The enforcement of age requirements varied dramatically across medieval Europe, and you travel from region to region observing these differences. In northern England, where life expectancy was particularly short due to harsh winters and frequent famines, you find families marrying their children as young as possible to ensure grandchildren before death claimed another generation. In wealthy Italian city-states, where families could afford to wait, marriages typically occurred later, with brides often reaching 17 or 18 before their wedding day. You discover that noble families played by different rules entirely, treating their children's marriages as diplomatic tools rather than personal milestones. Royal children might be betrothed as infants and are married as teenagers to cement international alliances, with their consent assumed rather than requested. Princess Isabella of France was betrothed to Edward II of England when she was only 6 years old, and you can almost feel the weight of political expectation pressing down on her small shoulders as she grows up knowing her entire purpose is to serve as a human treaty. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect you observe is how medieval society normalized these arrangements through elaborate justifications. Theologians argued that early marriage protected young people from the sin of premarital sexual activity, ignoring the psychological and physical dangers of forcing children into adult relationships. Medical authorities claimed that sexual activity was healthy for young people, though their understanding of human development was laughably primitive by modern standards. You witness the tragic consequences when these age rules collided with reality. Child brides frequently died in childbirth because their bodies weren't mature enough to handle pregnancy and delivery. Young husbands often struggled with the responsibilities of supporting families before they'd mastered their chosen trades. The mortality rates for teenage mothers and their babies were staggeringly high, yet medieval society accepted these deaths as natural consequences of God's will rather than preventable tragedies caused by social customs. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly believed these young marriages were appropriate or simply accepted them as economic necessities in a world where survival was never guaranteed. You see evidence supporting both interpretations: tender letters between young spouses who seemed genuinely devoted to each other, alongside court records documenting abuse, abandonment, and desperate attempts to escape unwanted unions. The Church's role in regulating marriage age reveals fascinating contradictions in medieval religious thought. The same institution that preached about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of spiritual maturity simultaneously blessed unions between children who couldn't possibly understand the theological significance of their vows. Parish priests often found themselves in impossible positions, required to verify that young couples were old enough for marriage while lacking any reliable way to determine their actual ages. You observe how the absence of birth records complicated age verification in ways that seem almost comical from a modern perspective. Families might claim their daughters were older than they actually were to secure better marriages, while others insisted their sons were younger to avoid unwanted betrothals. Priests developed elaborate tests to estimate ages, examining physical development, questioning children about historical events they might remember, even consulting local gossips about when certain births occurred. The legal complexity surrounding child marriages created opportunities for manipulation that you watch being exploited throughout medieval society. Unscrupulous families might arrange marriages for underage children, then later claim the unions were invalid to escape unfavourable economic arrangements. Conversely, some couples who married as adults found their unions challenged by relatives who claimed one party had been too young at the time of the ceremony, invalidating inheritance rights decades later. You notice how medieval concepts of consent evolved slowly as society grappled with the obvious problems created by child marriages. By the 13th century, canon lawyers began requiring that couples confirm their consent when they reached full adulthood, even if they'd been married as children. This innovation created yet another layer of complexity, as some spouses used these confirmation ceremonies to escape marriages they'd never wanted, while others felt pressured to honour commitments made by their childhood selves. The most chilling aspect of medieval marriage age regulations becomes clear as you observe their long-term impact on individual lives. Children who married young often remained emotionally stunted, never developing the independence and self-knowledge that comes from navigating adolescence as a single person. They moved directly from being controlled by parents to being controlled by spouses, never experiencing the freedom to discover their own desires, talents, or preferences Yet within this seemingly oppressive system, you occasionally glimpse moments of genuine tenderness and companionship. Some child marriages evolved into loving partnerships as the couple grew up together, sharing experiences and developing deep emotional bonds. These successful unions often became the examples cited by defenders of early marriage, though they conveniently ignored the many more cases where young spouses lived in misery or died trying to fulfill adult obligations with children's bodies and minds. You find yourself standing in the dim candlelight of a medieval abbey as monks painstakingly copy lists that will govern the lives of millions. Elaborate genealogies and relationship charts that determine who can marry whom. These aren't just family trees, they're legal documents that carry the weight of divine law, mapping out a web of forbidden connections so complex that even learned scholars struggle to navigate their intricacies. The scratching of quills on parchment echoes through stone corridors as these holy men compile what amounts to medieval Europe's first comprehensive database of romantic impossibilities. The Church's prohibition on marriage between relatives extended far beyond what modern minds might consider reasonable, reaching out to include seventh cousins, people who might share a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent they'd never heard of. You watch as families desperately search through fragmentary records, trying to trace bloodlines back through generations of illiterate ancestors, hoping to prove they're distant enough to legally wed. The irony isn't lost on you that in a world where most people couldn't write their own names, they were expected to maintain detailed genealogical records spanning 2 centuries, but blood relationship was just the beginning of medieval marriage restrictions. You discover the bizarre concept of spiritual kinship, where godparents and their families became forever forbidden to marry into their godchildren's lineage. This meant that the simple act of holding a baby during baptism could eliminate dozens of potential marriage partners for both families involved. The Church reasoned that spiritual bonds were as real and permanent as blood ties, creating invisible barriers that crisscrossed medieval society like tripwires, waiting to invalidate unwary couples' unions. You observe village priests struggling with these regulations as they try to determine whether young couples can legally marry, in small communities where everyone was related somehow. Finding marriage partners who didn't violate church law became a mathematical nightmare. Some villages developed informal systems of record keeping, with elderly women serving as living repositories of genealogical knowledge, able to recite relationships going back generations. These human databases became invaluable resources, consulted whenever romance bloomed between families whose connections had been forgotten over time. The complexity reached absurd levels when you consider affinity relationships, connections created by marriage rather than birth. If your brother married someone, you became related to that person's entire extended family and couldn't marry any of them. This created expanding circles of prohibition that could eliminate hundreds of potential spouses with a single wedding ceremony. You watch as medieval families tried to map these ever-growing webs of connection, sometimes discovering that their children's intended marriages were forbidden because of unions that had occurred decades earlier. Even more bewildering was the Church's position on relationships created by sexual contact outside marriage. If someone had intimate relations with the person, they became related by affinity to that person's entire family, making marriage to any relative impossible. This rule was intended to discourage premarital sex, but in practice it created situations where a single youthful indiscretion could eliminate dozens of marriage prospects for both parties involved. You can imagine the panic when young people realized their past mistakes had accidentally made them related to half the eligible partners in their community. The Church also prohibited marriages between people connected through legal adoption or fostering arrangements. Families who took in orphan children found themselves creating new categories of forbidden relationships. as these adopted members became spiritually related to their new family and couldn't marry any blood relatives of their guardians. This well-intentioned protection sometimes backfired, leaving orphaned children with even fewer marriage prospects than they would have had without benefactors' help. You witness the emergence of a cottage industry built around these marriage restrictions. Canon lawyers specializing in matrimonial law became wealthy by researching family connections and finding legal loopholes for desperate couples. These specialists developed elaborate charts and filing systems, creating medieval Europe's first professional genealogy services. Their fees were substantial, but for families facing the prospect of forbidden love, no price was too high to pay for legal validation of their relationships. The most bizarre restriction involved what the church called public propriety. If a couple became engaged but one partner died before the wedding, the surviving partner couldn't marry any blood relative of their deceased fiancé. This meant that broken engagements, even those ended by death rather than choice, created permanent barriers to future marriages. You observe families mourning not just the loss of their children, but also the marriage opportunities that died alongside them. Regional variations in enforcing these rules created a patchwork of different standards across medieval Europe. In some areas, local bishops took a relaxed approach, focusing only on the closest relationships and ignoring distant connections that couldn't be proven anyway. Other regions enforced the rules with mathematical precision, maintaining detailed records and investigating every claimed relationship with the thoroughness of modern forensic accountants. Historians still argue whether these elaborate restrictions served any practical purpose beyond demonstrating church authority over private relationships. Some scholars suggest they helped prevent inbreeding in small communities, though the genetic understanding necessary to make such arguments didn't exist in medieval times. Others believe the rules were primarily designed to give church courts control over inheritance and property transfers, since invalid marriages could void wills and land grants. You discover that wealthy families often found creative ways around these restrictions through dispensations, special permissions from high-ranking church officials that could override normal prohibitions. These dispensations weren't free, and they required substantial payments to church coffers and often took years to obtain. The system created a two-tiered marriage market where the rich could buy their way out of restrictions that absolutely bound the poor. The psychological impact of these rules on medieval society was profound. Young people grew up knowing that falling in love with the wrong person could create insurmountable legal obstacles, leading many to approach romance with caution rather than passion. Families became obsessed with genealogy not from historical interest, but from practical necessity, turning dinner conversations into detailed discussions of who was related to whom and how distantly. The enforcement of relationship prohibitions often relied on community knowledge and gossip networks that could make or break marriages years after they occurred. You watch as enemies used genealogical research as weapons, digging through family histories to find forbidden connections that could invalidate their rivals' unions. Some marriages were challenged decades after the wedding when ambitious relatives discovered previously unknown relationships that made the unions illegal under church law. The church's marriage restrictions created particular hardships for nobility, whose limited social circles made avoiding prohibited relationships nearly impossible. Royal families found themselves trapped in genealogical mazes, where every potential spouse was related through multiple bloodlines, forcing them to seek increasingly exotic marriage partners from distant kingdoms. This contributed to the international nature of medieval royal marriages. As local options were eliminated by relationship rules, you observe how these prohibitions affected different social classes in vastly different ways. Peasants often ignored the more distant relationship rules simply because they lacked the knowledge or resources to research their genealogies properly. Merchants and craftsmen fell somewhere in between, following the rules when convenient but finding ways around them when business interests demanded specific marriages. Only the nobility and clergy had both the motivation and resources to fully comply with every aspect of church relationship law. The system created opportunities for corruption that you see being exploited throughout medieval society. Unscrupulous officials could discover previously unknown relationships to break up marriages that threatened their interests, while others could be bribed to overlook obvious violations when the price was right. The complexity of the rules made it nearly impossible for ordinary people to verify whether their marriages were actually legal, leaving them vulnerable to manipulation by those with access to genealogical records. You enter the shadowy world of medieval economics where daughters transform into investment portfolios and marriages become elaborate financial transactions that would make modern stock traders dizzy with their complexity. The morning air fills with the sound of coins clinking as fathers calculate their daughters' worth in livestock, land, and silver, while mothers inventory household goods that will accompany their children into new families like corporate assets changing hands during a merger. This isn't the romantic courtship of fairy tales. This is medieval capitalism at its most raw and calculating, where love takes a distant back seat to ledger books and profit margins. You witness the intricate dance of dowry negotiations unfolding in the great halls of manor houses and the cramped workshops of craftsmen alike. The dowry system operates on principles that seem alien to modern sensibilities. Families essentially pay other families to take their daughters off their hands. But this payment comes with strings attached that can strangle unwary recipients. A bride's dowry might include cash, property, livestock, household goods, and even business partnerships. But these assets often come with conditions that bind the receiving family to obligations lasting decades. The calculations involved in dowry negotiations would challenge modern accountants with their Byzantine complexity. You observe fathers consulting with advisors, weighing the immediate cost of a generous dowry against the long-term benefits of securing a prestigious marriage alliance. A merchant might offer a substantial cash dowry to marry his daughter into minor nobility, calculating that the social elevation will benefit his remaining children and business prospects. Meanwhile, the noble family accepting the dowry must balance their need for ready money against the social costs of marrying beneath their station. But dowries aren't simple one-way payments, and you discover the elaborate system of reciprocal obligations that accompany these transactions. The groom's family typically provides a mourning gift or dower, property or income that will support the bride if she becomes widowed. This creates a complex web of financial interdependence where both families essentially hold each other's assets hostage to ensure good treatment of their children. The bride brings wealth into the marriage but retains certain rights to it, while the groom's family provides security but can't fully control the resources they receive. You watch as different social classes approach dowry negotiations with varying strategies and expectations. Peasant families might offer a cow, some household linens, and perhaps a small plot of land, negotiations that take place over kitchen tables with handshake agreements sealed by shared ale. Merchant families conduct their discussions like business mergers, with written contracts specifying every detail from the exact number of silver coins to the thread count of bed linens. Noble families treat dowry negotiations as international diplomacy, with teams of lawyers, financial advisors, and political counselors crafting agreements that might reshape regional power balances. The timing of dowry payments creates additional layers of complexity that you observe causing countless disputes in medieval courts. Some families promise elaborate dowries but pay them in installments over years or decades, creating ongoing financial relationships between families that can sour if economic conditions change. Others front-load their payments but retain rights to reclaim assets if marriages fail or produce no heirs. The most cunning negotiators structure their dowries to maintain maximum leverage over their daughter's treatment, while minimizing their own financial exposure. You discover how the dowry system creates perverse incentives that shape medieval family dynamics in unexpected ways. Families with multiple daughters face exponential financial pressures, sometimes forcing them to choose which children receive generous dowries and which must settle for modest marriages or religious life. This economic reality transforms birth order and gender into financial liabilities, with some families secretly celebrating when daughters die young because it eliminates future dowry obligations. The inflation of dowry expectations over time creates an arms race mentality that you observe spreading across medieval society like a financial epidemic. As some families offer increasingly generous dowries to secure prestigious marriages, other families find themselves forced to match these offers or accept lower status unions for their children. The result is a spiral of escalating costs that can bankrupt established families and create opportunities for newly wealthy merchants to buy their way into social circles previously closed to them. Regional variations in dowry customs reveal fascinating differences in how medieval societies valued women and structured family relationships. In some areas, you observe reverse dowries where grooms' families pay bride prices to acquire wives, typically in societies where women's labour is particularly valuable or where demographic imbalances create competition for brides. Other regions practice minimal dowry systems, focusing instead on elaborate wedding celebrations that demonstrate family wealth without creating ongoing financial obligations. The Church's position on dowries reflects the institution's complex relationship with wealth and worldly concerns, while officially discouraging excessive focus on material considerations in marriage. Church leaders accept and even encourage dowry payments that benefit religious institutions. You watch as families donate portions of their daughters' dowries to monasteries or churches in exchange for prayers, religious ceremonies, or spiritual benefits, creating yet another layer of financial obligation in medieval marriage negotiations. Historians still argue whether the dowry system empowered or oppressed medieval women, and you can see evidence supporting both interpretations playing out simultaneously. Some brides use their dowry rights to maintain independence within marriage, threatening to reclaim their assets if mistreated by husbands or in-laws. Others find themselves trapped by dowry obligations that make divorce financially impossible, as returning to their birth families would require repaying dowries their families can no longer afford. The legal complexity surrounding dowry rights creates opportunities for both protection and exploitation that you observe being manipulated throughout medieval society. Sophisticated contracts might include clauses protecting brides' interests, specifying conditions under which dowries can be reclaimed or transferred to children. However, illiterate families often find themselves bound by agreements they don't understand, discovering too late that their daughters' dowries have been structured to benefit grooms' families exclusively. You witness the emergence of professional dowry negotiators and marriage brokers who specialize in structuring these complex financial arrangements. These medieval matchmakers operate like investment bankers, maintaining detailed knowledge of family finances, social standings, and market conditions that affect marriage prospects. Their services become essential for families navigating the increasingly sophisticated world of matrimonial finance. Though their fees add yet another cost to already expensive marriage negotiations, The seasonal nature of dowry payments creates cash flow problems that you observe affecting medieval economic cycles. Families often time their daughters' marriages to coincide with harvest seasons or business cycles when they have maximum liquidity, creating predictable patterns in marriage frequency that mirror agricultural and commercial rhythms. These timing considerations can delay marriages for years while families accumulate sufficient resources, sometimes causing romantic relationships to wither under financial pressure. The psychological impact of reducing daughters to financial assets becomes evident as you observe family dynamics shaped by dowry considerations. Some fathers view their daughters primarily through economic lenses, calculating return on investment for the education, clothing, and social presentation that might increase marriage prospects. Daughters grow up knowing their value is measured in coins and contracts, creating complex emotional relationships with their own worth and place in society. International dowry negotiations between royal and noble families create diplomatic opportunities and vulnerabilities that you watch being exploited by medieval politicians. A generous dowry might smooth the path for military alliances or trade agreements, while dowry disputes can escalate into international incidents that reshape political relationships. The movement of substantial wealth across borders through marriage, dowries becomes a form of medieval international finance that affects currency values and trade balances. The dowry system creates inheritance complications that plague medieval legal systems for generations. When marriages fail or produce no heirs, determining what happens to dowry assets requires complex calculations involving original agreements, subsequent modifications, and competing claims from multiple families. Some dowry disputes continue for decades, passed down through generations like inherited lawsuits that consume more resources than the original assets were worth. You observe how the dowry system intersects with medieval concepts of honour and social status, creating situations where families bankrupt themselves to maintain appearances. The size and composition of a daughter's dowry becomes a public statement and is about family wealth and social position, forcing some families to offer dowries they can't afford rather than accept the social humiliation of omitting financial limitations. You stand outside the heavy wooden doors of a medieval church on a crisp morning where your breath forms clouds in the cold air, watching as one of history's most peculiar wedding ceremonies unfolds before your eyes. The bride and groom aren't even inside the sacred building yet. They're conducting the most important part of their marriage ritual right here on the church porch, in full view of neighbours who've gathered like spectators at a sporting event. This isn't some quaint medieval custom designed for charm. This is serious legal business where every word, gesture, and witness matters more than life itself. Because what happens in the next few minutes will determine not just the couple's fate, but potentially the inheritance rights of children not yet born. The ritual you're witnessing follows a precise choreography that's been refined over centuries, with each element serving both spiritual and legal purposes that interweave like threads in an elaborate tapestry. The priest stands between the couple and the church doors, symbolically blocking their entry until they've properly committed to each other in the sight of God and community. His Latin words echo off stone walls as he questions each partner about their willingness to enter this sacred bond. But the real drama lies in the responses, which must be given freely and clearly enough for witnesses to confirm later in court if necessary. You observe the exchange of rings, but this isn't the simple romantic gesture modern couples know. Medieval wedding rings carry deep symbolic weight. They are circles representing eternity, placed on the fourth finger because ancient medical knowledge claimed a vein ran directly from that digit to the heart. The groom places the ring first on the bride's thumb while saying, "In the name of the Father," then moves it to her index finger for "and of the Son," then to her middle finger for "and of the Holy Spirit," finally settling it on the ring finger with Amen. This elaborate procedure serves as both religious ritual and legal proof that proper vows were exchanged. The bride's attire tells its own story as you examine the layers of meaning woven into medieval wedding fashion. Her dress isn't necessarily white, that tradition won't emerge for centuries, but instead reflects her family's wealth and social status through expensive fabrics, intricate embroidery, and precious accessories. The veil covering her hair represents her transition from maiden to wife, a symbolic covering that acknowledges her changing role in society. Some brides wear crowns or circlets, temporary queenly symbols that mark this as the most important day of their lives. When they briefly become the centre of community attention, you witness the peculiar custom of asking the banns, where the priest has publicly announced this wedding for 3 consecutive Sundays, giving anyone with objections time to step forward. This isn't mere ceremony, it's a legal requirement designed to prevent bigamous marriages, unions between relatives, or other canonical violations that could invalidate the marriage later. The fact that no one has objected today means the community has collectively verified that this union meets church requirements, making everyone present complicit in the marriage's validity. The exchange of vows reveals the startling reality that many medieval couples are repeating words they don't understand, hence the ceremony is conducted in Latin, while most participants speak only local dialects. You watch as nervous brides and grooms stumble through pronunciations coached by priests, hoping they're promising the right things to each other. The standard vow formula requires each partner to promise fidelity, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, creating legal obligations that will bind them until death regardless of how their feelings change. But the most shocking aspect of medieval wedding ceremonies becomes apparent as the priest leads the newly married couple inside the church for the final blessing, the bed ceremony that will follow later. Medieval society doesn't consider marriage fully consummated until the couple has shared a bed, preferably with witnesses nearby to confirm that consummation has occurred. This means the beautiful ceremony you've just witnessed is only the first act in a wedding drama that won't conclude until tomorrow morning, when the community can be satisfied that the marriage has been physically completed. You observe how different social classes adapt these standard rituals to fit their circumstances and budgets. Noble weddings might last for days, with elaborate feasts, tournaments, and entertainment that showcase family wealth and political alliances. The ceremony itself takes place in grand cathedrals with bishops officiating, multiple choirs singing, and hundreds of witnesses representing the cream of medieval society. These aren't just weddings, they are diplomatic events where international relations get negotiated alongside marriage vows. Merchant families strike a middle ground between peasant simplicity and noble extravagance, hosting ceremonies that demonstrate their prosperity without overreaching their social station. Their weddings feature good food, quality musicians, and respectable numbers of guests, but avoid the ostentatious displays that might offend noble neighbours or bankrupt the family. The ceremony itself follows standard church protocols, but the celebration afterward reflects careful calculations about how much display is appropriate for their social position. Peasant weddings reveal the most touching aspects of medieval marriage ceremonies, where genuine community support replaces expensive pageantry. You watch as entire villages contribute to wedding celebrations, with neighbours providing food, entertainment, and labour to ensure young couples start their married lives with proper community blessing. The ceremony might take place at a simple parish church with a local priest, but the emotional investment from friends and family often exceeds what money can buy at grander celebrations. The seasonal timing of medieval weddings reflects agricultural rhythms and religious calendar restrictions that create predictable patterns in marriage frequency. You notice most weddings occur in late spring or early summer when food is plentiful and weather cooperates, but couples must avoid Lent, Advent, and other religious seasons when the church prohibits marriage ceremonies. This creates bottlenecks where dozens of couples might marry on the same day, turning individual celebrations into community festivals. Historians still argue whether medieval wedding ceremonies were primarily religious or legal events, and you can see elements of both purposes intertwining throughout the rituals. The church provides spiritual framework and moral authority, but the legal implications often seem more pressing to participants who need valid marriages to secure inheritance rights, legitimize children, and formalize family alliances. The ceremony serves both God and Caesar, creating sacred bonds that also function as binding contracts. The role of witnesses in medieval wedding ceremonies reveals the community's investment in the individual marriages that extends far beyond romantic support. These aren't just friends and family celebrating love. They're legal participants whose testimony might later be required to prove the marriage actually occurred. Medieval society operates on oral tradition and personal relationships, making witness memory more reliable than written records for most legal purposes. The wedding guests are essentially signing a contract with their presence. You observe how wedding ceremonies adapt to accommodate illiterate participants while still maintaining legal validity. Since most medieval people can't read or write, the ceremony relies heavily on spoken words, physical gestures, and symbolic objects that can be remembered and described later. The ring exchange, the joining of hands, the spoken vows. All these elements serve as memorable markers that witnesses can recall if the marriage's validity is ever questioned in court. The integration of pagan and Christian elements in medieval wedding ceremonies creates fascinating cultural hybrids that reveal how slowly old traditions die. You notice rituals involving fertility symbols, seasonal decorations, and community customs that predate Christianity by centuries but have been absorbed into church-sanctioned ceremonies. The church accepts these adaptations as long as the core Christian elements remain prominent, creating regional variations in wedding customs that reflect local cultural heritage. The post-ceremony celebrations reveal different attitudes toward marriage across medieval social spectrum. Noble families use wedding feasts to display wealth and cement political relationships, with elaborate entertainment and expensive gifts that serve diplomatic as well as celebratory purposes. Merchant families focus on business networking opportunities, using wedding celebrations to strengthen commercial relationships and to display their prosperity to potential partners. Peasant families emphasize community bonding and mutual support, with celebrations that reinforce social networks essential for survival in agricultural societies. The blessing of the marriage bed represents perhaps the most intimate aspect of medieval wedding ceremonies, where religious authority extends into the most private moments of human experience. You witness priests blessing bedrooms, sprinkling holy water on marriage bed, and offering prayers for fertility and marital harmony. This religious involvement in sexual relationships reflects the Church's determination to control every aspect of human reproduction and family formation. The legal documentation of medieval marriages reveals the ceremony's dual nature as both spiritual sacrament and binding contract. While many marriages rely on oral tradition and witness testimony, wealthy families increasingly commission written records that detail not just the wedding ceremony, but also property transfers, inheritance arrangements, and family obligations created by the union. These documents become precious family treasures, more valuable than gold because they prove legitimacy and secure inheritance rights for future generations. You find yourself in the marble halls of ecclesiastical courts where the impossible becomes routine. Medieval couples seeking divorce in a world where the church declares marriage eternally indissoluble, as permanent as death itself. The irony fills these solemn chambers like incense, thick and choking, as desperate husbands and wives present elaborate legal arguments to prove their marriages never actually existed in the first place. This isn't divorce as we understand it. This is an intricate dance of theological loopholes and canonical technicalities where skilled lawyers can make years of married life vanish like morning mist, transforming wives into strangers and children into bastards with the stroke of a pen. The Church's position on marriage dissolution seems crystal clear, until you examine the Byzantine complexity of annulment procedures that have evolved to accommodate human misery while maintaining theological consistency. Marriage may be indissoluble in theory, but canon lawyers have discovered dozens of conditions that can retroactively invalidate unions, essentially erasing them from history. You watch as these legal scholars pass through marriage ceremonies with the precision of forensic investigators, searching for any flaw that might provide grounds for annulment. The most common escape route you observe involves proving lack of proper consent at the time of marriage, a strategy that requires creative interpretations of medieval psychology and legal theory. Lawyers argue that their clients were too young to understand their vows, too frightened to refuse unwanted marriages, or too mentally impaired to comprehend the sacred nature of their commitments. These arguments can invalidate marriages that lasted decades and produced multiple children, suddenly transforming legitimate families into legal fiction through retroactive reasoning that would impress modern divorce attorneys. You discover the peculiar category of marriages deemed invalid due to impediments, pre-existing conditions that made the union impossible from the beginning, even if nobody knew about them at the time. These might include secret blood relationships discovered years after the wedding, previous marriages that were forgotten or concealed, or religious vows that participants had taken and abandoned. The Church maintains elaborate records to track these impediments, creating a medieval database of romantic impossibilities that grows more complex each year. The process of proving impediments requires investigation techniques that would challenge modern private detectives. You watch as church officials interview elderly relatives, examine baptismal records, and piece together genealogies spanning generations to determine whether marriages violated canonical prohibitions. Witnesses must swear to the truth of their testimony under threat of eternal damnation, creating a legal system where perjury carries consequences extending far beyond earthly punishment. Physical consummation plays a crucial role in annulment proceedings that brings medieval courts uncomfortably close to bedroom activities. The Church recognizes that unconsummated marriages can be dissolved more easily than those where couples have become one flesh through sexual union. This creates bizarre legal situations where the intimate details of married couples' private lives become matters of public record, with witnesses testifying about sleeping arrangements, physical compatibility, and evidence of sexual activity or its absence. You observe the delicate legal category of marriages involving impotence, where medieval medicine's limited understanding of sexual dysfunction creates opportunities for creative annulment arguments. Men who claim inability to consummate their marriages can escape unwanted unions, but only after undergoing humiliating medical examinations by church-appointed physicians and surviving cross-examinations about their sexual histories. The system creates perverse incentives where temporary impotence becomes permanent liberation, while successful sexual performance traps unhappy husbands in lifelong commitments. The role of coercion in annulment proceedings reveals medieval society's complex understanding of free will and family authority. You watch as couples argue they were forced into marriages against their will, but determining the difference between appropriate family pressure and unacceptable coercion requires Solomon-like wisdom from church judges. Daughters who are pressured by fathers might have grounds for annulment, but those who merely felt obligated to obey parental wishes do not, creating legal distinctions that often seem arbitrary to modern observers. Historians still argue whether the annulment system provided genuine relief for trapped spouses or simply created new forms of abuse where wealthy families could escape inconvenient marriages while poor couples remained permanently bound. The evidence you observe supports both interpretations, with some annulments clearly serving justice while others obviously manipulate legal technicalities to achieve results that would be impossible through honest divorce proceedings. The financial costs of annulment proceedings place them beyond the reach of most medieval couples, creating a two-tiered system where wealth determines access to marital freedom. You watch as noble families spend fortunes on legal fees, expert witnesses, and church donations to secure annulments that dissolve politically inconvenient unions, while peasant couples remain trapped in abusive marriages they can't afford to escape. The system essentially allows the rich to buy their way out of commitments that bind the poor absolutely. The timeline for annulment proceedings can stretch across years or even decades, creating legal limbo where couples live in marital uncertainty while their cases wind through ecclesiastical bureaucracy. You observe families torn apart by ongoing annulment litigation, with children uncertain about their legitimacy and property rights hanging in balance while church courts deliberate. Some couples die before their cases are resolved, leaving their heirs to inherit not just property but also ongoing legal disputes about family legitimacy. The appeal process for annulment decisions creates additional layers of complexity that can extend proceedings indefinitely. Dissatisfied parties can appeal to higher church authorities, potentially taking cases all the way to Rome where papal courts might overturn decisions made by local bishops. This creates situations where couples might be declared unmarried by one court, married by another, and unmarried again by a third, with their legal status changing like weather patterns while they struggle to live normal lives. The impact of successful annulments on children reveals the cruel mathematics of medieval canon law, where legitimate offspring can become bastards overnight. If their parents' marriage is declared invalid, the Church attempts to protect children through various legal doctrines, but these protections often prove inadequate when annulments retroactively erase the marriage awards that created family legitimacy. You watch as noble children lose inheritance rights and social status when their parents' unions are dissolved, creating new forms of family tragedy. The political implications of high-profile annulments transform individual marital disputes into international incidents that can reshape diplomatic relationships. Royal annulments require papal approval and often involve complex negotiations between church authorities and secular rulers who view marriage dissolutions as threats to political alliances. You observe how annulment proceedings become proxy battles for larger conflicts between religious and temporal authority, with individual happiness sacrificed to institutional power struggles. The development of specialized annulment lawyers creates a new professional class within medieval legal systems. Experts who master the intricate details of canonical marriage law and develop reputations for achieving impossible results. These ecclesiastical attorneys command substantial fees and wield enormous influence over family fortunes, essentially holding the power to rewrite history by proving that marriages never validly existed. Their success depends on encyclopedic knowledge of church law combined with creative interpretation skills that would impress modern constitutional scholars. The regional variations in annulment practices reveal how local church authorities adapt universal canon law to accommodate cultural differences and political pressures. Some bishops take liberal approaches that favour annulment petitioners, while others maintain strict standards that make dissolution nearly impossible. These differences create forum shopping opportunities where couples might relocate to jurisdictions with more favourable annulment policies, adding geographic complications to already complex legal proceedings. The psychological impact of annulment proceedings on medieval couples involves more than just marital stress. It threatens their entire understanding of identity and family legitimacy. You observe spouses who have lived together for decades suddenly arguing that they were never truly married, children questioning their own legitimacy, and extended families choosing sides in disputes that can destroy generations of relationships. The process forces participants to rewrite their personal histories, transforming years of shared life into legal mistakes that officially never happened. The documentation requirements for annulment cases create extensive paper trails that provide historians with intimate glimpses into medieval private life, but also demonstrate the bureaucratic complexity that made these proceedings so expensive and time-consuming. Every aspect of the original marriage must be examined and recorded, from the circumstances of the initial courtship through the details of wedding ceremonies to the daily realities of married life, creating archives that preserve medieval domesticity in uncomfortable detail. You slip through the shadows of medieval villages where whispered words carry more legal weight than royal proclamations, witnessing couples who create marriages as easily as they might order bread from a baker, and just as casually destroy kingdoms in the process. The morning mist swirls around secret meetings where young lovers exchange simple vows that seem innocent enough. Yet these casual promises will later topple governments, void treaties, and send armies marching across Europe. This is the bizarre world of clandestine marriage, where the Church's own rules create loopholes so enormous that two people can legally wed with nothing more than "I take you as my wife and I take you as my husband," spoken in private with no witnesses except perhaps a curious squirrel. The theological foundation for secret marriages rests on the Church's emphasis on consent as the essential element of valid matrimony, but you watch as this well-intentioned principle creates chaos that medieval society struggles to contain. According to canon law, if two people freely consent to marry each other and express that consent in words of present commitment, they create a valid sacramental marriage regardless of location, witnesses, or clerical involvement. This means a couple could legally wed while walking through a forest, sitting in a tavern, or even lying in bed together, creating unions that are spiritually binding but practically impossible to prove or disprove. You observe the panic these secret marriages create among noble families who discover their carefully arranged political alliances have been derailed by clandestine vows exchanged months or years earlier. A prince betrothed to a foreign princess for diplomatic purposes might reveal on his wedding day that he's already married to his childhood sweetheart, invalidating international treaties and potentially triggering wars. The Church must honour these secret unions if they can be proven valid, creating situations where individual romantic choices override centuries of political planning. The legal complications multiply exponentially when you consider that secret marriages often leave no documentation, relying entirely on the testimony of participants who might have reasons to lie about when and how their vows were exchanged. Court cases involving clandestine marriages become exercises in medieval forensic investigation, with judges trying to determine whether couples are telling the truth about private conversations that occurred months or years earlier. The burden of proof falls on those claiming marriage, but the standards of evidence remain frustratingly vague. You discover the phenomenon of competing marriage claims, where individuals might find themselves legally married to multiple people simultaneously through various secret ceremonies and formal arrangements. A woman might exchange clandestine vows with her true love, then be forced into an arranged marriage with her family's choice, creating a legal nightmare where two men have valid claims to the same wife. Church courts must untangle these conflicting relationships using canonical precedence rules that often seem arbitrary to the people whose lives they govern. The most scandalous aspect of secret marriages becomes apparent as you observe their use by unscrupulous individuals who exploit the system for sexual or financial gain. Men seduce women with promises of marriage, exchange clandestine vows to overcome moral objections to premarital intimacy, then disappear, leaving their wives with no proof of their unions and no legal recourse. These seduction marriages create a category of victims who are technically married but practically abandoned, unable to remarry legally but equally unable to claim support from husbands who deny their relationships. The Church's attempts to control clandestine marriages through increasingly strict regulations create a cat-and-mouse game between official authority and popular practice that you watch playing out across medieval Europe. Bishops require bans to be read publicly before marriages, mandate witness requirements, and impose penalties for secret weddings. But these measures prove largely ineffective against couples determined to marry without official approval. The very theological principles that make secret marriages valid prevent the Church from invalidating them even when they violate procedural requirements. You witness the emergence of professional witnesses who specialize in testifying about secret marriages for appropriate fees, creating a black market in marital proof that serves both legitimate couples seeking to validate their unions and fraudsters attempting to create false marriages for inheritance or political purposes. These mercenary witnesses develop reputations for reliability and discretion, becoming essential players in the underground economy of clandestine matrimony. The regional variations in enforcing secret marriage prohibitions reveal the practical difficulties of controlling private behaviour through institutional authority. Some areas develop informal tolerance for clandestine unions, with local communities accepting secret marriages as valid regardless of church disapproval. Other regions maintain strict enforcement that drives secret marriages underground, creating parallel systems of marriage recognition that operate outside official channels. Historians still argue whether secret marriages represented genuine expressions of romantic freedom or sophisticated legal manipulations designed to circumvent social and political constraints. The evidence you observe supports both interpretations, with some clandestine unions clearly motivated by authentic love, while others obviously serve calculated purposes that have little to do with emotional attachment. The impact of secret marriages on inheritance law creates cascading legal complications that can affect property rights for generations. Children born to secret marriages might be considered legitimate by church law, but illegitimate by secular courts that don't recognize their parents' union, creating dual legal statuses that complicate inheritance claims. Some noble families find their carefully planned succession arrangements disrupted by previously unknown secret marriages that suddenly legitimize bastard children or invalidate presumed heirs. The psychology of secret marriage appeals to medieval couples who find themselves trapped between personal desires and family expectations, offering an escape route that seems to satisfy both individual autonomy and religious requirements. You observe young people who feel empowered by their ability to create legally binding marriages without parental consent, though many discover too late that valid marriages require more than just canonical legitimacy to function successfully in medieval society. The documentation challenges surrounding secret marriages lead to innovative approaches to proof that anticipate modern forensic techniques. Couples begin creating private written records of their clandestine vows, hiding marriage certificates in secret locations where they can be retrieved if needed later. Some develop elaborate systems of coded messages and symbolic objects that serve as evidence of their unions, creating a medieval cryptography of romantic commitments. The economic implications of secret marriages extend beyond individual families to affect entire communities that must deal with disputed inheritance claims, challenged property transfers, and uncertain family relationships. You watch as villages struggle to determine which children are legitimate heirs, which women are entitled to dower rights, and which men bear responsibility for family support when secret marriages complicate traditional assumptions about family structure. The international diplomatic consequences of secret marriages involving nobility create ongoing challenges for medieval foreign relations. Treaties based on marriage alliances can be invalidated by previously unknown clandestine unions, forcing kingdoms to renegotiate agreements or find alternative diplomatic solutions. Some rulers begin requiring extensive investigations into potential spouses' marital histories before finalizing international marriage arrangements. The development of specialized church courts to handle secret marriage disputes creates new categories of ecclesiastical legal expertise, with canon lawyers who specialize in the complex evidentiary requirements for proving clandestine unions. These courts develop increasingly sophisticated procedures for evaluating witness testimony, authenticating documentary evidence, and determining the validity of disputed marriages, essentially creating medieval family courts centuries before secular legal systems recognized the need for such specialized jurisdiction. The social stigma surrounding secret marriages varies dramatically across different levels of medieval society, with noble families treating clandestine unions as scandalous betrayals of family honor, while peasant communities might view them as acceptable alternatives to expensive formal ceremonies. These different attitudes create tension when secret marriages cross social boundaries, bringing together families with incompatible expectations about marital legitimacy and family obligation. The long-term impact of secret marriage traditions shapes medieval concepts of individual autonomy and family authority in ways that anticipate modern debates about personal freedom versus social responsibility. You observe how the possibility of clandestine marriage empowers young people to assert control over their romantic destinies, while simultaneously creating new forms of family conflict and social instability that challenge traditional hierarchical relationships. The enforcement mechanisms for secret marriage regulations reveal the practical limitations of institutional authority in controlling private behavior, as church officials struggle to monitor and regulate intimate relationships that by definition occur beyond official oversight. The gap between theoretical legal control and practical enforcement capabilities creates space for individual agency that gradually transforms medieval marriage customs despite official resistance. You ascend the marble steps of royal palaces, where love letters read like military dispatches and wedding invitations resemble peace treaties, entering a rarefied world where individual hearts become pawns in geopolitical chess games spanning continents. The rustle of silk gowns mingles with the whispered conversations of ambassadors as they calculate the political value of royal bloodlines, while nervous young princes and princesses pace gilded corridors knowing their romantic futures will be decided by map makers and treasury officials rather than their own preferences. This isn't marriage as personal commitment. This is matrimony as international diplomacy, where saying "I do" might prevent wars, forge alliances, or accidentally trigger the collapse of dynasties that have ruled for centuries. You witness the elaborate negotiations preceding royal marriages that make modern international trade agreements seem simple by comparison. Teams of diplomats spend months or even years hammering out details that extend far beyond the couple involved, crafting documents that specify everything from dowry amounts and territorial transfers to religious practices and succession rights for children not yet conceived. These marriage treaties function as comprehensive political compacts that reshape the balance of power across medieval Europe, with romantic compatibility ranking far below strategic advantage in the minds of negotiators. The age at which royal children enter marriage negotiations would shock modern sensibilities, as you observe infants being betrothed before they can walk, and toddlers having their romantic fates sealed by parents who view them primarily as diplomatic assets. Princess Isabella of Valois was betrothed to Richard II of England when she was only 6 years old, beginning a relationship that would define both their lives despite the fact that they wouldn't meet until her teenage years. These childhood betrothals create strange hybrid relationships where diplomatic necessity masquerades as personal commitment. You discover the peculiar practice of proxy marriages where royal couples wed through representatives, sometimes never meeting their spouses until years after their wedding ceremonies. A princess might marry a wooden doll representing her distant groom, or a knight might place a ring on a stand-in bride's finger, while the actual princess remains hundreds of miles away. These surreal ceremonies create legally binding marriages between people who are essentially strangers, reducing some of history's most powerful individuals to interchangeable game pieces in political strategies. The international marriage market for medieval nobility operates according to principles that would make modern human traffickers blush, with royal daughters being evaluated like livestock for their bloodline purity, fertility prospects, and political connections. You watch as ambassadors compile detailed reports on potential brides, assessing everything from their physical appearance and educational accomplishments to their family's military strength and territorial holdings. These clinical evaluations reduce young women to collections of assets and liabilities measured against strategic objectives. The logistics of royal courtship reveal the absurd lengths to which medieval politics will go to maintain diplomatic pretenses. Suitors might spend years exchanging letters and gifts with intended brides they have never seen, building romantic relationships through intermediaries who craft carefully worded correspondence designed to advance political objectives while maintaining the fiction of personal choice. You observe young royals falling in love with idealized portraits and flowery descriptions that bear little resemblance to the actual people they are expected to marry. The wedding ceremonies themselves become spectacular displays of international cooperation or competition, with guest lists that read like United Nations assemblies and festivities that can bankrupt kingdoms through their extravagance. You watch as royal weddings transform into diplomatic summits, where secondary negotiations take place during banquet courses and dancing partners are chosen based on treaty obligations rather than personal preference. These celebrations serve multiple audiences simultaneously: subjects who need evidence of royal prosperity, foreign dignitaries who require appropriate honour, and potential enemies who must be impressed by displays of wealth and power. The consummation requirements for royal marriages create bizarre situations where intimate moments become matters of state concern, with witnesses present to verify that marriages have been properly completed and heirs can be legitimately expected. You observe the strange ritual of bedding ceremonies where wedding guests escort newlyweds to their chambers and remain nearby to confirm that consummation has occurred, transforming the most private human experiences into public political events with international implications. Historians still argue whether royal marriage politics actually achieved their intended diplomatic objectives or simply created new sources of international conflict. And you can see evidence supporting both conclusions as you observe the long-term consequences of matrimonial alliances. Some royal marriages successfully cemented lasting peace between former enemies, while others created inheritance disputes that triggered wars lasting longer than the marriages themselves. The role of religion in royal marriage negotiations adds another layer of complexity that can override political considerations when theological differences prove irreconcilable. You watch as promising diplomatic marriages collapse when families cannot agree on which religious ceremonies should take precedence, where wedding ceremonies should occur, or how children should be raised. The Protestant Reformation will later transform these religious considerations into insurmountable obstacles that reshape the entire European marriage market. The economic implications of royal marriages extend far beyond dowry payments to include territorial transfers, trade agreements, and financial obligations that can determine the prosperity of entire kingdoms. You observe how marriage negotiations become comprehensive economic summits where ambassadors calculate the long-term value of various alliance options, sometimes discovering that romantic partnerships carry price tags exceeding national treasuries. The psychological impact on royal children who grow up knowing their marriages will serve political rather than personal purposes creates a unique category of medieval trauma that shapes personality development in ways historians are only beginning to understand. You watch as young princes and princesses learn to suppress personal desires in favour of dynastic obligations, developing emotional defence mechanisms that allow them to function in systems that treat their intimate relationships as business transactions. The failure rate of politically motivated royal marriages reveals the fundamental incompatibility between diplomatic objectives and personal happiness, with many unions ending in separation, infidelity, or outright warfare between spouses who never chose each other. You observe couples who fulfill their diplomatic obligations by producing heirs but then live essentially separate lives, maintaining public facades of marital harmony while pursuing personal satisfaction through discreet affairs or other relationships. The international implications of royal marriage failures can be as significant as the original diplomatic objectives, with divorce proceedings or annulment attempts creating new sources of conflict between kingdoms that had hoped to cement their relationships through matrimonial alliances. Some royal separations trigger succession crises that last for generations, as competing claimants use marriage validity as weapons in ongoing political struggles. The development of increasingly sophisticated royal marriage contracts reflects medieval society's growing understanding of the complex relationships between personal commitment and political obligation. You watch as lawyers craft ever more detailed agreements that attempt to anticipate and prevent the various ways matrimonial diplomacy can backfire, creating documents that function simultaneously as romantic promises and international treaties. The cultural exchange facilitated by royal marriages creates unexpected benefits that often outlast the political objectives they were designed to serve. You observe how foreign queens bring new artistic traditions, educational practices, and technological innovations to their adopted kingdoms, enriching cultural development in ways that transcend their immediate diplomatic purposes. Some royal marriages fail as political alliances, but succeed as conduits for intellectual and artistic advancement. The succession complications created by royal marriages to foreign partners generate ongoing diplomatic challenges that can persist for centuries after the original marriage's end. Children with claims to multiple thrones create potential conflicts that may remain dormant for generations before erupting into international incidents when political circumstances align with inherited rights. The regional variations in royal marriage customs reveal different cultural approaches to balancing individual autonomy with political necessity. You observe how northern European kingdoms tend toward more formal diplomatic procedures, while Mediterranean royal families maintain greater flexibility in marriage arrangements. creating different expectations and opportunities for matrimonial alliances that reflect broader cultural differences. The evolution of royal marriage practices anticipates modern concepts of international relations and diplomatic protocol, with medieval matrimonial negotiations developing many of the procedural innovations that will later characterize formal diplomacy. You're watching the birth of systematic international relations disguised as romantic ceremonies, but actually functioning as sophisticated political instruments that reshape the medieval world. You trudge down muddy village paths where marriage negotiations unfold between the smell of fresh bread and the lowing of cattle, discovering a world where peasant couples navigate the same church laws that govern royal unions while dealing with the harsh realities of seasonal labour, crop failures, and survival that would break the spirit of any pampered nobleman. The contrast couldn't be starker. While kings marry for kingdoms, these weathered farmers marry for an extra pair of hands during harvest season and someone to share the burden of raising children who might not survive their first winter. Yet somehow, within this brutal framework of economic necessity, you glimpse moments of genuine tenderness and practical wisdom that suggest peasant marriages might understand love better than all the poetic romances celebrated in noble courts. The timing of peasant weddings revolves around agricultural cycles that dictate every aspect of rural life, creating marriage seasons as predictable as planting and harvest schedules. You observe couples delaying their weddings until after spring planting is complete, when families can spare the time and resources for celebration without jeopardizing the year's crops. Most peasant marriages occur in late spring or early summer, when food stores are adequate but harvest pressures haven't yet begun, creating brief windows of opportunity between the relentless demands of agricultural survival. The economic calculations underlying peasant marriage arrangements reveal a sophisticated understanding of resource management that would impress modern financial planners, despite being conducted by people who may never have seen a written contract. You watch as families evaluate potential matches based on land holdings, livestock ownership, specialized skills, and family connections that could provide mutual support during difficult seasons. A miller's daughter brings valuable grain processing knowledge to a farming family, while a blacksmith's son offers tool repair skills that could save neighbouring families from crop disasters. The dowry negotiations among peasant families demonstrate remarkable creativity in assembling valuable packages from limited resources, transforming household goods and agricultural assets into substantial marriage settlements. A bride might bring a cow, several chickens, household linens woven by her mother, preserved foods that could last through winter, and perhaps most valuable of all, the skills to manage these resources effectively. You observe families spending years accumulating dowry components, with mothers teaching daughters not just how to cook and sew, but how to maximize the value of limited resources through careful planning and skilled labour. The church's marriage requirements create particular hardships for peasant families who must balance religious obligations with economic survival, often finding creative compromises that satisfy canonical law while accommodating practical necessities. You watch as poor couples save for months to afford church wedding fees, sometimes postponing marriages for years while accumulating the necessary resources. Some families organise group weddings where multiple couples share the costs of ceremonies and celebrations, creating community events that strengthen village bonds while making religious requirements financially manageable. The informal marriage customs that persist alongside official church ceremonies reveal how peasant communities adapt religious requirements to fit their practical needs and cultural traditions. You observe couples who consider themselves married after exchanging promises before village elders, even though they may not formalize their unions with church ceremonies until they can afford proper fees. These community-recognised marriages often function perfectly well for years before receiving official religious blessing, creating parallel marriage systems that serve different purposes. The seasonal nature of peasant labour creates unique challenges for newlywed couples who must immediately integrate their economic activities while learning to live together as husband and wife. You watch as young couples coordinate their work schedules around planting and harvest demands that leave little time for romantic adjustment periods enjoyed by wealthier newlyweds. The success of peasant marriages often depends more on compatible work habits and complementary skills than on emotional compatibility, though the best unions manage to develop both practical cooperation and personal affection. The role of extended family in peasant marriages extends far beyond ceremonial support to include practical assistance that can determine whether young couples survive their first years of marriage. You observe multi-generational households where newly married couples live with parents or relatives, sharing resources and labour while gradually establishing their independence. These arrangements provide essential support systems for young families, but also create potential conflicts when different generations have conflicting ideas about household management or child-rearing practices. Historians still argue whether peasant marriages were more or less successful than noble unions, and you can see evidence supporting various conclusions as you observe the daily realities of rural matrimony. Peasant couples certainly face greater material hardships, but they also enjoy more practical equality and shared responsibility than noble wives who often live as ornamental appendages to their husbands' political careers. The necessity of mutual cooperation in peasant households creates partnerships that might be more emotionally satisfying than the formal hierarchies that govern aristocratic marriages. The impact of seasonal food shortages on peasant marriages reveals how economic stress can both strengthen and strain matrimonial bonds, with couples either pulling together to survive difficult periods or breaking apart under pressures that exceed their coping abilities. You watch as some families emerge from lean years with stronger relationships forged through shared hardship, while others succumb to conflicts over resource allocation that can destroy even previously harmonious marriages. The childbearing pressures on peasant wives create particularly intense challenges that combine economic necessity with personal risk, as families need children for agricultural labour but face high infant mortality rates that can devastate both family economics and parental emotions. You observe women who bear children almost annually, while maintaining demanding work schedules that would challenge modern working mothers, often caring for larger families while managing substantial household responsibilities that include food production, textile work, and seasonal agricultural labour. The informal divorce customs among peasant communities reveal how economic pressures can override religious prohibitions when marriages become economically unsustainable or personally unbearable. While the church forbids divorce, you observe peasant couples who simply separate and form new relationships when their original unions fail, often with community acceptance that prioritizes practical survival over canonical regulations. These informal separations create complex family arrangements that may persist for years without official resolution. The education and courtship opportunities available to peasant young people differ dramatically from noble customs, with most romantic relationships developing through shared work activities and community gatherings rather than formal social events designed for matrimonial purposes. You watch as young people meet during harvest celebrations, religious festivals, and market days that combine business activities with social interaction, creating natural opportunities for couples to evaluate each other's character and practical abilities alongside physical attraction. The inheritance patterns among peasant families create marriage strategies that focus on preserving family resources while providing for all children, often requiring complex negotiations about which children will inherit land and which must seek their fortunes through marriage or alternative careers. You observe families carefully planning their children's marriages to maintain optimal landholdings, while ensuring that younger children receive adequate support through strategic matrimonial alliances with neighbouring families. The migration patterns created by peasant marriage customs reveal how matrimonial alliances facilitate movement between communities and regions, with young people often moving considerable distances to join spouses, families and communities. These marriage-driven migrations create networks of family connections that span multiple villages and regions, facilitating trade relationships and mutual support systems that help rural communities survive economic and environmental challenges. The religious practices surrounding peasant marriages demonstrate how rural communities adapt church requirements to fit their spiritual needs and practical circumstances, often creating hybrid ceremonies that combine Christian elements with local traditions that predate medieval Christianity. You observe wedding customs that include fertility rituals, seasonal celebrations, and community blessings that reflect peasant understanding of the marriage as fundamentally connected to agricultural cycles and natural rhythms. The legal complications affecting peasant marriages reveal how church marriage law creates particular hardships for people who lack the resources to navigate complex canonical requirements or challenge unfavourable legal decisions. You watch as poor couples struggle with inheritance disputes, legitimacy questions, and marriage validity challenges that wealthy families could resolve through expensive legal proceedings, creating a two-tiered justice system that often leaves peasant families vulnerable to exploitation. The community and support systems surrounding peasant marriages demonstrate the collective investment that rural societies make in individual family success, with entire villages contributing to wedding celebrations and providing ongoing assistance to young couples during their early years of marriage. These community networks serve as informal insurance systems that help families survive individual crises while maintaining village stability and continuity across generation. The seasonal rhythms of peasant marriage life create predictable patterns of work and celebration that integrate matrimonial relationships into the broader cycles of agricultural life. With couples learning to coordinate their personal needs with the demanding schedules of planting, cultivation, and harvest that determine rural survival and prosperity. You enter the shadowy confessionals and monastery halls where the church wages war against its own human nature, watching as centuries of married clergy traditions crumble under new theological demands that transform priests from family men into solitary servants of God. The irony weighs heavy in these sacred spaces. The same institution that controls marriage for everyone else now forbids it to those who administer the sacrament, creating a class of religious professionals who must counsel couples about relationships they are forbidden to experience themselves. You witness the profound social earthquake that shakes medieval Europe as the Church enforces celibacy requirements that will uproot thousands of clerical families and reshape the fundamental character of religious authority. The historical precedent for married clergy stretches back to Christianity's earliest days, when many apostles and church leaders maintained wives and families while serving their religious communities. You observe a medieval world where married priests have been the norm for centuries, with clerical families forming the backbone of parish life and religious education. These priest fathers pass down theological knowledge through family lineages, creating clerical dynasties that maintain stability and continuity in rural communities where literacy and religious learning might otherwise disappear entirely. The gradual campaign to enforce clerical celibacy unfolds like a military operation, with successive popes issuing increasingly strict decrees that meet fierce resistance from clergy who view marriage as their natural right rather than spiritual obstacle. You watch as Pope Gregory VII, launches the most determined assault on clerical marriage, declaring that priests who refuse to abandon their wives should be stripped of their positions and their religious services considered invalid. This isn't merely changing job requirements, it's declaring that thousands of previously valid marriages are now sinful obstacles to salvation. The human cost of celibacy enforcement becomes apparent as you observe the destruction of established clerical families, where priests must choose between their vocations and their loved ones. Some clergy abandon their wives and children to maintain their positions, creating a generation of abandoned families with no legal recourse or social support. Others refuse to comply and find themselves excommunicated from the church they have served faithfully for decades, losing not just their careers but their entire social identities and community standing. The practical complications of transitioning to celibate clergy create administrative nightmares that church officials struggle to resolve through increasingly complex regulations and exemptions. You watch as bishops attempt to determine which clerical marriages are valid and honour through grandfather clauses, while still enforcing new celibacy requirements for future ordinations. Some regions develop compromise solutions where married men can become priests but cannot advance to higher positions, creating hierarchical systems that institutionalize clerical marriage discrimination. The economic implications of eliminating clerical families extend far beyond individual hardship to affect entire communities that depend on priest-led households for education, health care, and social services. You observe rural parishes where priests' wives have traditionally served as midwives, teachers, and community organizers, providing essential services that disappear when clerical celibacy eliminates these family structures. The transition to celibate clergy creates service gaps that some communities struggle to fill through alternative arrangements. The resistance movements that emerge among married clergy reveal the depth of opposition to celibacy requirements that many priests view as unnatural innovations contradicting biblical precedent and practical wisdom. You witness organized protests, petition campaigns, and even violent confrontations as married priests attempt to defend their right to maintain families while serving their religious calling. Some regions experience virtual clerical strikes where married priests refuse to perform religious services until their family rights are recognized. The theological justifications for clerical celibacy evolve as church leaders attempt to provide convincing explanations for requirements that seem to contradict earlier old Christian practices and biblical teachings. You observe elaborate arguments claiming that celibate priests can better serve their congregation without family distractions, that unmarried clergy provide superior spiritual guidance, and that celibacy creates mystical connections between priests and divine authority that married men cannot achieve. Historians still argue whether clerical celibacy strengthened or weakened medieval church authority, and you can see evidence supporting both interpretations as the policy's long-term consequences become apparent. Some communities develop deeper respect for priests who sacrifice family life for religious service, while others become skeptical of clerical authority exercised by men who lack personal experience with marriage and family responsibilities that dominate most people's lives. The enforcement mechanisms for clerical celibacy create new categories of church police who investigate priests' personal lives and monitor their compliance with marriage prohibitions. You watch as bishops appoint special investigators to verify that clergy remain unmarried and report violations that could result in removal from office. These celibacy enforcement systems create an atmosphere of suspicion and surveillance within religious communities that previously operated on trust and mutual respect. The impact on religious education becomes evident as the elimination of clerical families removes traditional systems for training young men for priesthood through apprenticeships with married priest fathers. You observe the development of new seminary systems designed to educate celibate clergy in institutional settings rather than family environments, fundamentally changing how religious knowledge is transmitted and preserved across generations. The social consequences of clerical celibacy extend beyond religious communities to affect medieval attitudes toward marriage and sexuality in ways that influence secular society's development. You witness growing emphasis on celibacy as spiritual ideal that elevates unmarried life above matrimonial commitment, creating cultural tensions between religious teachings that praise celibacy and social systems that depend on marriage and family formation for stability and continuity. The regional variations in enforcing celibacy requirements reveal how local church authorities adapt universal policies to accommodate cultural differences and practical necessities. Some bishops take strict approaches that eliminate all married clergy within their jurisdictions, while others develop flexible interpretations that allow existing clerical families to continue while preventing new clerical marriages. These different enforcement strategies create confusing patchworks of policy implementation across medieval Europe. The psychological impact on individual priests forced to choose between family and vocation creates lasting trauma that affects both personal development and professional effectiveness. You observe clergy who abandon their families struggling with guilt and depression that impairs their ability to provide effective pastoral care, while those who choose family over vocation often experience profound identity crises that affect their entire life trajectories. The development of alternative family structures among celibate clergy reveals how human social needs find expression even within restrictive institutional frameworks. You watch as some priests develop quasi-familial relationships with housekeepers, nieces, or other female relatives who provide domestic support and companionship while maintaining appearance of canonical compliance. These arrangements sometimes evolve into relationships that violate celibacy requirements despite official denials. The financial consequences of clerical celibacy affect church economics in ways that extend far beyond individual priests to influence institutional resource allocation and property management. You observe how eliminating clerical families reduces church financial obligations while concentrating clerical property ownership in institutional rather than family hands, fundamentally changing how religious wealth is accumulated and distributed across generations. The recruitment challenges created by celibacy requirements become apparent as qualified candidates increasingly refuse to consider religious careers that demand family sacrifice. You watch as some regions struggle to find adequate numbers of priests willing to accept celibacy obligations, creating clerical shortages that affect religious service quality and community spiritual guidance availability. The international implications of clerical celibacy policies create diplomatic complications when different regions maintain conflicting standards for religious authority recognition. Some kingdoms refuse to accept religious services from married priests, while others reject celibate clergy as spiritually inferior, creating ecclesiastical conflicts that affect international relations and religious unity across medieval European boundaries. The long-term cultural impact of clerical celibacy shapes medieval European civilization in ways that extend far beyond immediate religious concerns to influence art, literature, education, and social development. You observe how the creation of celibate clergy class affects intellectual development, artistic patronage, and cultural transmission in ways that will influence European civilization for centuries, creating new forms of religious authority while eliminating traditional family-based approaches to spiritual guidance and community leadership. You walk through medieval graveyards where fresh flowers mark the end of first marriages and new possibilities begin to bloom among the weathered headstones, entering a world where death paradoxically creates freedom that living spouses could never achieve through divorce or separation. The morning mist clings to cemetery gates as you observe widows and widowers navigating a complex social landscape that views them simultaneously as tragic figures deserving sympathy and potential threats to established family structures. Here, in the shadow of mortality, medieval marriage rules reveal their most fascinating contradictions, where the church that forbids divorce suddenly celebrates remarriage, and women who spent their first marriages as legal property discover they can own businesses, make contracts, and choose their own romantic destinies. The legal transformation that occurs when medieval women become widows represents one of the most dramatic status changes possible in a society that typically offers little opportunity for social mobility or personal autonomy. You witness wives who spent decades under their husband's legal guardianship suddenly emerging as independent economic actors capable of owning property, conducting business, and making marriage decisions without male oversight. This metamorphosis from legal dependency to personal freedom creates a class of women who possess both practical experience and newfound authority that makes them valuable marriage partners for ambitious men. The dower rights that protect widows reveal medieval society's recognition that women deserve some security after their husbands' deaths, though the specific provisions vary dramatically based on social class and regional customs. You observe noble widows who inherit substantial estates and maintain aristocratic lifestyles, merchant widows who take over family businesses and continue commercial operations, and peasant widows who receive small plots of land or livestock that provide basic subsistence. These inheritance rights create a safety net that prevents immediate destitution while providing resources that make remarriage attractive rather than desperate. The timeline pressures surrounding widow remarriage reflect medieval society's complex attitudes toward female independence and family stability. You watch as communities that initially support grieving widows gradually develop expectations that they should remarry within reasonable periods, particularly if they're young enough to bear children or wealthy enough to attract suitors. The sweet spot for widow remarriage typically falls between 6 months and 2 years after a husband's death, long enough to demonstrate proper grief but short enough to prevent family property from remaining under female control indefinitely. The Church's position on widow remarriage creates theological complications that require careful navigation between biblical precedents that both encourage and discourage second marriages. You observe priests who must balance St. Paul's advice that widows should remain unmarried with practical recognition that remarriage prevents poverty and provides social stability. The official church position gradually evolves to accept widow remarriage as preferable to the alternatives of destitution or irregular relationships, though some religious authorities continue to view second marriages as spiritually inferior to original unions. The economic calculations that drive widow remarriage decisions reveal sophisticated financial planning that would impress modern estate managers, as widows evaluate potential husbands based on their ability to preserve and enhance inherited resources while providing personal security and companionship. You watch as wealthy widows conduct elaborate courtship negotiations that resemble business mergers more than romantic relationships, with suitors required to demonstrate their financial responsibility and commitment to preserving their wives' property rights. The social dynamics surrounding widower remarriage follow different patterns that reflect medieval assumptions about male authority and domestic management needs. You observe widowers who remarry quickly, not necessarily from grief, but from practical inability to manage households and raise children without female assistance. These rapid remarriages often focus on finding competent domestic managers rather than romantic partners, creating marriages of convenience that serve practical purposes while maintaining appropriate social appearances. The competition among potential suitors for attractive widows creates marriage markets that operate according to supply and demand principles that would fascinate modern economists. You witness bidding wars where multiple men compete for wealthy widows by offering increasingly generous settlement terms, property protections, and lifestyle guarantees. These competitive courtships sometimes result in marriage contracts that provide widows with better terms than they enjoyed in their first marriages, as suitors attempt to outbid rivals for access to valuable widow resources. Historians still argue whether widow remarriage represented genuine empowerment or simply different forms of male control disguised as female choice. And you can observe evidence supporting both interpretations as you watch widows navigate their second marriage options. Some widows clearly use their newfound independence to secure better husbands and more favourable marriage terms, while others find themselves pressured into remarriages that serve family interests rather than personal preferences. The age considerations that affect widow remarriage reveal medieval society's pragmatic approach to matching couples based on fertility prospects, economic compatibility, and social appropriateness rather than romantic attraction or emotional compatibility. You observe older widows who typically remarry men of similar age for companionship and mutual support, while younger widows often attract older men who value their proven fertility and domestic skills over their emotional availability. The impact of children from first marriages on widow remarriage creates complex family dynamics that require careful negotiation between new spouses and existing offspring, who may view stepfathers as threats to their inheritance prospects. You watch as widows balance their children's interests against their own needs for security and companionship, sometimes choosing remarriage partners based primarily on their willingness to treat stepchildren fairly, rather than their personal attractiveness or romantic appeal. The regional variations in widow remarriage customs reveal different cultural approaches to balancing individual autonomy with family stability and community welfare. Some areas develop informal courtship systems where widows receive multiple suitors and choose freely among acceptable candidates, while other regions maintain stricter family control over widow remarriage decisions that prioritize property preservation over personal preference. The documentation requirements for widow remarriage create legal complexity that sometimes exceeds the paperwork involved in first marriages, as couples must verify the validity of previous marriages, confirm the legal status of inherited property, and establish clear terms for managing blended family resources. You observe widows who become amateur lawyers by necessity, learning to navigate church courts and civil law to protect their interests and ensure their remarriage contracts provide an adequate security. The seasonal patterns of widow remarriage reflect both practical considerations about agricultural cycles and social customs that affect when communities consider remarriage appropriate. You watch as most widow remarriages occur during late spring and early summer, when resources are adequate for wedding celebrations and community attention can focus on matrimonial rather than survival concerns. The psychological adjustment challenges facing widow remarriage often exceed those of first-time marriages, as participants must blend established routines, accommodate existing children, and manage property relationships while also developing new romantic and domestic partnerships. You observe couples who struggle to create unified households from previously separate family structures, particularly when remarriage occurs quickly after bereavement, and emotional adjustment remains incomplete. The international implications of noble widow remarriage can affect diplomatic relationships and political alliances in ways that extend far beyond individual family concerns. You watch as royal and aristocratic widows become diplomatic assets whose remarriage decisions can strengthen or weaken international relationships depending on their choice of second husbands and the political implications of resulting family alliances. The business opportunities created by widow remarriage enable some women to expand commercial activities and accumulate wealth in ways that were impossible for continuously married women who remain under permanent male oversight. You observe merchant widows who use remarriage as opportunities to combine business operations, access new markets, and expand commercial networks through strategic matrimonial alliances that serve both personal and professional objectives. The development of specialized legal expertise around widow remarriage creates new categories of medieval legal professionals who specialize in the complex intersection of inheritance law, marriage regulations, and property rights that govern second marriages. These legal specialists become essential advisors for wealthy widows who need expert guidance to navigate the complicated legal landscape surrounding remarriage while protecting their financial interests and family obligations. The long-term demographic impact of widow remarriage affects medieval population patterns and family structure in ways that influence regional development and social stability. You observe how remarriage rates affect birth rates, inheritance patterns, and family formation cycles that shape community development and economic growth across different regions and social classes, creating feedback loops between individual marriage decisions and broader social transformation. You enter the dusty chambers of medieval law where scribes bend over parchment documents that transform human love into legal obligations as binding as chains forged in iron, watching as the most intimate aspects of marriage become subject to contractual terms that would make modern corporate lawyers weep with admiration for their thoroughness. The scratching of quills mingles with heated negotiations as families hammer out agreements that specify everything from bedroom conduct to inheritance rights for grandchildren not yet conceived. These aren't simple wedding contracts. They are comprehensive legal frameworks that govern every conceivable aspect of matrimonial life, creating binding obligations that extend decades into the future and affect people who haven't even been born yet. The evolution of marriage contracts reflects medieval society's growing sophistication in anticipating and preventing the countless ways human relationships can generate legal disputes, with each new agreement incorporating lessons learned from previous matrimonial disasters. You observe contracts that grow increasingly complex over time, expanding from simple property arrangements to elaborate documents that read like a constitutional frameworks for miniature kingdoms. These legal instruments attempt to codify everything from daily household management to procedures for resolving marital disputes, creating artificial certainty in relationships that are inherently unpredictable and emotional. The property clauses in marriage contracts reveal the fundamental economic reality underlying medieval matrimony, where romantic relationships function primarily as wealth transfer mechanisms between families seeking to optimize their financial positions through strategic alliances. You watch as lawyers craft intricate provisions that specify exactly which assets belong to wives, which remain under husbands' control, and which become joint property subject to complex management arrangements. These property divisions often prove more important than the emotional compatibility of spouses, since financial disputes can destroy families long after romantic feelings have faded. The inheritance provisions embedded in marriage contracts create multi-generational legal obligations that bind unborn children to arrangements their parents negotiated years before their conception. You observe clauses that determine succession rights for specific property, establish trust-like arrangements for managing family wealth, and even specify educational and marriage obligations for future offspring. These inherited contract terms sometimes conflict with later family circumstances, creating legal straitjackets that prevent adaptive responses to changing conditions. The behavioral requirements specified in some marriage contracts would shock modern couples with their intrusive detail about personal conduct, spousal obligations, and domestic arrangements that transform private relationships into legal performances subject to enforcement mechanisms. You watch as some agreements specify frequency of intimate relations, requirements for spousal consultation on major decisions, and even dress codes for wives that reflect their husband's social status. These behavioural clauses essentially create legal scripts for married life that leave little room for spontaneity or personal growth. The dispute resolution procedures outlined in marriage contracts anticipate conflict with the thoroughness of experienced military strategists, establishing elaborate systems for mediating disagreements and preventing minor disputes from escalating into family wars. You observe contracts that specify which relatives or community leaders should arbitrate different types of marital conflict, creating formal procedures for addressing everything from financial disagreements to allegations of adultery. Some contracts even establish penalty systems where spouses face financial consequences for violating specific terms. The religious clauses in marriage contracts reflect the complex intersection between canon law and civil obligations, with some agreements attempting to create enforceable requirements for spiritual behaviour that extend church authority into domestic relationships. You watch as contracts specify religious observance requirements, charitable giving obligations, and even pilgrimage commitments that bind couples to demonstrate their piety through legally mandated actions. These religious contract terms sometimes conflict with personal spiritual development or changing theological understanding. Historians still argue whether elaborate marriage contracts strengthened or weakened medieval marriages by reducing spontaneous affection and trust to legal obligations, and you can see evidence supporting both interpretations as you observe long-term matrimonial outcomes. Some couples clearly benefit from having explicit agreements that prevent misunderstandings and provide frameworks for resolving conflicts, while others find that excessive legal structure stifles emotional intimacy and personal growth within their relationships. The enforcement mechanisms for marriage contracts create parallel legal systems that operate alongside church courts and civil authorities, with some families essentially establishing private judicial systems for managing matrimonial obligations. You observe wealthy families that maintain their own legal advisors specifically for contract enforcement, creating mini bureaucracies dedicated to monitoring compliance with matrimonial terms and resolving violations through internal procedures that avoid public court involvement. The modification procedures built into marriage contracts reflect recognition that human relationships naturally evolve over time and require adaptive legal frameworks that can accommodate changing circumstances without invalidating entire agreements. You watch as some contracts include amendment procedures that allow couples to renegotiate terms based on changed financial circumstances, health conditions, or family situations that couldn't be anticipated at the time of original agreement. The international implications of marriage contracts become apparent when agreements involve parties from different kingdoms with conflicting legal systems, creating complex jurisdictional questions about which laws apply to various contract provisions. You observe negotiations that must accommodate multiple legal traditions simultaneously, with contracts written to be enforceable under different court systems that may have incompatible approaches to property rights, inheritance law, and marital obligations. The social class variations in marriage contract complexity reveal how legal sophistication correlates with wealth and education, creating different matrimonial legal systems for different segments of medieval society. You watch as noble families commission contracts that run dozens of pages and require teams of lawyers to draft and interpret, while peasant couples rely on simple oral agreements witnessed by village elders and recorded in basic written forms when literacy allows. The professional development of marriage contract specialists creates new categories of legal expertise within medieval law practice, with some lawyers developing reputations specifically for drafting matrimonial agreements that balance competing family interests while minimizing future dispute potential. These matrimonial legal experts command substantial fees and wield considerable influence over family fortunes through their ability to structure agreements that protect or expose their clients to various risks. The documentation standards for maribimautumed contracts reflect medieval society's transition from oral tradition to written legal culture, with increasing emphasis on precise language and formal procedures that can withstand challenge in various court systems. You observe the gradual development of standardized contract terminology and formatting that makes matrimonial agreements more predictable and enforceable. Though regional variations in legal customs continue to create complexity, the taxation implications of marriage contracts reveal how matrimonial legal arrangements intersect with broader fiscal obligations to feudal lords and church authorities who may claim portions of wealth transferred through marriage agreements. You watch as families structure contracts to minimize tax exposure while still achieving their matrimonial objectives, creating complex financial arrangements that serve multiple purposes simultaneously. The archival preservation of marriage contracts creates extensive legal databases that provide historians with detailed insights into medieval family relationships while also serving contemporary legal purposes when inheritance disputes arise generations after original agreements were signed. You observe how some marriage contracts remain legally relevant for centuries, affecting property rights and family obligations long after the original parties have died. The psychological impact of detailed marriage contracts on spousal relationships reveals how explicit legal obligations can both clarify expectations and create artificial constraints that interfere with natural relationship development. You watch as some couples benefit from having clear agreements about roles and responsibilities, while others struggle with the formal nature of relationships governed by legal documents rather than organic emotional bonds. The regional variations in marriage contract law reflect different cultural approaches to balancing individual autonomy with family authority and community welfare, creating a patchwork of legal systems that offer different protections and obligations for married couples depending on their geographic location and cultural background. The economic efficiency gained through standardized marriage contracts enables medieval society to reduce transaction costs associated with matrimonial negotiations, while providing more predictable legal frameworks that facilitate family planning and wealth management across generations. You observe how legal standardization makes marriage negotiations more efficient while still allowing customization for specific family circumstances and objectives. The long-term legal legacy of medieval marriage contracts influences modern matrimonial law development in ways that persist centuries after the original social conditions that created these agreements have disappeared, creating continuities between medieval legal innovation and contemporary family law that demonstrate the enduring human need for legal frameworks governing intimate relationships. You journey across the diverse landscapes of medieval Europe where marriage customs shift as dramatically as the terrain itself, discovering that crossing from one kingdom to another means entering entirely different worlds of matrimonial law, where practices considered sacred in one region are forbidden sins in another. The morning fog lifts from alpine valleys to reveal Swiss communities where cousin marriages are encouraged for economic consolidation, while just beyond the mountain passes, French territories treat the same relationships as scandalous violations of divine law. This isn't merely academic variation, these are fundamental differences that can transform legal spouses into adulterous sinners simply by travelling from one diocese to another, creating a medieval landscape where love itself becomes geography dependent. The Germanic marriage traditions you encounter in northern European territories reflect ancient tribal customs that emphasize practical partnerships and family alliances over romantic idealization, creating matrimonial systems that prioritize economic cooperation and clan loyalty above individual emotional satisfaction. You observe communities where marriages function essentially as business mergers between extended families, with elaborate negotiations that focus on land consolidation, trade partnerships, and mutual defense obligations that will bind clans together for generations. These Germanic traditions view marriage as fundamentally communal rather than personal, treating individual preferences as secondary considerations that shouldn't interfere with broader family strategies. The Mediterranean marriage customs reveal dramatically different cultural values that emphasize honor, family reputation, and female chastity in ways that create much more restrictive environments for women, while providing greater emphasis on romantic courtship and masculine competition for desirable brides. You watch as Italian and Spanish communities develop elaborate codes of conduct around courtship and marriage that transform the romantic relationships into complex social performances where families' public reputations depend on their members' adherence to increasingly refined behavioral expectations. The Celtic marriage remnants persisting in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales preserve ancient traditions that allow temporary marriages, trial unions, and divorce arrangements that directly contradict church teachings but continue operating through community acceptance and cultural momentum. You observe handfasting ceremonies where couples commit to year-long trial marriages that can be dissolved without stigma if they prove incompatible, creating flexibility that accommodates human nature's unpredictability while maintaining social stability through alternative relationship structures. The Scandinavian marriage practices you encounter emphasize gender equality and mutual respect in ways that anticipate modern relationship ideals, while maintaining traditional frameworks for family formation and community integration. You watch as Norwegian and Swedish communities develop marriage customs that grant women substantial property rights, decision-making authority, and social autonomy that would shock southern European societies where female subordination is considered natural and divinely ordained. The Eastern European marriage traditions reflect complex cultural mixing between Slavic customs, Byzantine religious influences, and Western Catholic requirements that create hybrid systems attempting to satisfy multiple cultural traditions simultaneously. You observe Polish and Hungarian communities where marriage negotiations must accommodate competing religious authorities, different inheritance laws, and conflicting cultural expectations about family structure and spousal obligations. The urban versus rural marriage variations within individual regions reveal how economic structure and social density affect matrimonial customs more than geographic location or political boundaries. You watch as medieval cities develop marriage practices that emphasize commercial partnerships and professional alliances, while rural areas maintain agricultural marriage customs focused on land management and seasonal labor coordination that reflect fundamentally different economic priorities and lifestyle requirements. The religious diversity across medieval Europe creates matrimonial complications that extend beyond simple Catholic versus Orthodox divisions to include Islamic territories in Spain, Jewish communities throughout Europe, and persistent pagan practices in recently converted regions. You observe how religious minorities develop parallel marriage systems that satisfy their own cultural requirements while maintaining sufficient compatibility with dominant Christian customs to avoid persecution or legal complications. Historians still argue whether regional marriage variations represented genuine cultural diversity or simply different adaptations to similar underlying social and economic pressures. And you can see evidence supporting both interpretations as you observe how different communities solve similar matrimonial challenges through various cultural approaches that reflect their unique historical experiences and environmental conditions. The legal complications created by marriage mobility between regions with different customs generate ongoing disputes that medieval church and civil courts struggle to resolve through increasingly complex jurisdictional arrangements. You watch as couples who marry legally in one region find their unions challenged when they move to areas with different marriage requirements, creating legal uncertainties that can affect inheritance rights, child legitimacy, and family status for generations. The trade route influences on marriage customs reveal how commercial networks facilitate cultural exchange that gradually homogenizes matrimonial practices across regions connected by regular economic interaction. You observe how merchant families develop standardized marriage contracts and courtship procedures that function effectively across multiple jurisdictions, creating international matrimonial customs that anticipate modern globalized relationship patterns. The political boundaries versus cultural boundaries create situations where official territorial divisions fail to reflect actual matrimonial practice zones, with some marriage customs extending across multiple kingdoms, while others remain localized within small geographic areas regardless of political control. You watch as cultural regions maintain their distinct marriage traditions despite changing political authority, demonstrating the persistence of social customs that transcend governmental control. The seasonal migration patterns affecting some European communities create unique challenges for maintaining consistent marriage customs when populations move regularly between regions with different matrimonial requirements. You observe pastoral communities that must navigate between highland and lowland marriage customs as they follow seasonal grazing patterns, creating complex hybrid practices that accommodate both geographic mobility and cultural consistency. The military campaign impacts on marriage customs become apparent as armies, crusades, and political conflicts expose communities to foreign matrimonial practices that gradually influence local traditions through cultural contact and intermarriage. You watch as returning soldiers bring home foreign wives and unfamiliar marriage customs that slowly modify traditional practices in ways that reflect broader patterns of medieval cultural exchange and military expansion. The monastery and pilgrimage route influences create corridors of standardized religious practice that gradually harmonize marriage customs along major travel routes while leaving isolated communities free to maintain distinctive local traditions. You observe how areas connected to major religious centers develop similar matrimonial practices regardless of their political or ethnic affiliations, demonstrating the homogenizing influence of religious authority on local customs. The climate and agricultural variations across Europe affect marriage timing, family size expectations, and economic arrangements in ways that create regionally distinctive matrimonial patterns, reflecting environmental adaptation rather than cultural preference. You watch as northern communities develop marriage customs adapted to short growing seasons and harsh winters, while Mediterranean regions create different practices suited to year-round agricultural activity and different demographic pressures. The linguistic boundaries often correlate with marriage custom variations in ways that suggest language groups maintain distinct matrimonial traditions even when subject to similar political and religious authorities. You observe how communities speaking related languages often share similar marriage practices, regardless of their current political affiliations, indicating deep cultural connections that persist despite surface political changes. The technological differences between regions affect marriage customs through their impact on economic activity, social organization, and family structure that create different matrimonial needs and opportunities. You watch as areas with advanced agricultural techniques develop different marriage patterns than regions still using primitive farming methods, demonstrating how technological development influences social organization, including matrimonial customs. The demographic variations across medieval Europe create different marriage markets and family formation pressures that result in regionally distinctive matrimonial practices adapted to local population patterns and economic opportunities. You observe how areas with population surpluses develop different marriage customs than regions experiencing demographic decline, with matrimonial practices adapted to optimize population distribution and economic development. The artistic and literary traditions that develop in different regions both reflect and influence local marriage customs through their celebration of particular relationship ideals and matrimonial values. You watch as regional cultural productions reinforce distinctive marriage practices while also facilitating cultural exchange that gradually modifies local traditions through exposure to alternative relationship models and matrimonial possibilities. You slip into the shadows of medieval villages where desperate lovers craft ingenious schemes to circumvent marriage laws that seem designed to thwart human happiness at every turn. Watching as ordinary people transform into cunning legal strategists who would make modern lawyers proud of their creativity in finding loopholes within seemingly impenetrable regulatory systems. The candlelight flickers over forged documents and whispered conspiracies as couples, families, and communities collaborate in elaborate deceptions that reveal just how oppressive and impractical these marriage rules have become when they collide with the messy realities of human desire, economic necessity, and social survival. The most common rule-breaking strategy you observe involves fabricating genealogical records to eliminate inconvenient family relationships that would prohibit desired marriages under church consanguinity laws. You watch as enterprising couples hire scribes to create alternative family trees that conveniently omit problematic ancestors or invent fictional lineages that place them outside prohibited relationship boundaries. These forged genealogies sometimes become so elaborate that entire communities collaborate in maintaining false family histories that allow multiple couples to marry while technically complying with canonical requirements. The timing manipulations surrounding age requirements reveal sophisticated understanding of legal technicalities that allow families to marry underage children by exploiting bureaucratic confusion about birth dates and age verification procedures. You observe parents who claim their children are older than their actual ages, sometimes supported by entire communities willing to provide false testimony about birth dates that occurred before reliable record-keeping systems existed. These age deceptions often involve complex conspiracies where multiple families coordinate their lies to maintain consistent false chronologies. The creative interpretations of consent requirements provide another avenue for circumventing restrictive marriage laws, with some families developing elaborate theatrical performances designed to demonstrate voluntary agreement while actually coercing unwilling participants into unwanted unions. You watch as communities stage fake courtship rituals where apparent romantic interest masks family pressure and economic manipulation, creating marriages that technically meet canonical consent requirements while violating their spirit through sophisticated deception. The bribery networks that develop around church officials reveal the corruption that inevitably emerges when legal systems become so complex and restrictive that compliance becomes impossible for ordinary people. You observe elaborate payment schemes where families pool resources to purchase dispensations, false documents, or simply official blindness to obvious rule violations. These corruption systems sometimes involve entire clerical hierarchies, with standardized bribery rates for different types of marriage violations and informal price lists for various canonical exemptions. The sanctuary and jurisdiction shopping strategies demonstrate sophisticated understanding of legal geography that allows couples to exploit territorial boundaries and competing authorities to escape restrictive local marriage laws. You watch as lovers flee to neighbouring jurisdictions with more lenient requirements, sometimes travelling hundreds of miles to find bishops willing to perform marriages that would be forbidden in their home territories. These romantic refugees create international incidents when different church authorities dispute the validity of cross-border marriages. The false identity schemes that emerge among desperate couples reveal the lengths to which medieval people will go to escape family arrangements or canonical prohibitions that threaten their happiness or survival. You observe elaborate conspiracies where individuals assume new names, fabricate personal histories, and even fake their own deaths to escape unwanted betrothals or forbidden relationships. These identity frauds sometimes involve entire communities willing to provide false testimony and forge documents to help lovers escape oppressive circumstances. The professional smuggling networks that develop around marriage law violations create underground economies where specialized criminals provide illegal matrimonial services for appropriate fees. You watch as marriage smugglers develop sophisticated operations that include forged document production, corrupt official networks, safe house systems, and even military protection for couples fleeing family persecution. These criminal matrimonial enterprises operate like modern organized crime families, complete with territorial boundaries and professional hierarchies. Historians still argue whether widespread rule-breaking represented resistance to unjust laws or simple criminality motivated by selfish desires, and you can see evidence supporting both interpretations as you observe the various motivations behind different types of marriage law violations. Some rule-breaking clearly serves genuine justice by helping loving couples escape arbitrary restrictions, while other violations obviously exploit legal loopholes for financial gain or social advantage. The community complicity that enables large-scale marriage law violations reveals how entire societies can unite in resistance to unpopular regulations that conflict with local customs and common sense. You observe villages where everyone participates in maintaining false stories about family relationships, birth dates, and marriage histories that allow their neighbours to marry according to traditional customs rather than canonical requirements. These community conspiracies demonstrate impressive social coordination in service of collective resistance to external authority. The technological innovations developed specifically for marriage law evasion include sophisticated document forgery techniques, secret communication systems, and even primitive forms of identity verification that anticipate modern criminal methods. You watch as medieval forgers develop specialized skills in replicating different regional writing styles, creating authentic-looking seals and signatures, and aging documents to make recent forgeries appear decades old. The legal precedent manipulations that emerge among educated rule-breakers reveal sophisticated understanding of canonical law that rivals professional church lawyers in its complexity and creativity. You observe wealthy families who hire scholarly advisors to research obscure legal precedents and canonical interpretations that might provide legitimate justification for otherwise prohibited marriages. These legal research projects sometimes uncover genuine loopholes that benefit not just individual clients, but entire communities facing similar restrictions. The international implications of marriage law violations create diplomatic complications when rule-breaking involves noble families, whose marriages affect political alliances and treaty obligations. You watch as kingdoms struggle to address marriage law violations that threaten carefully negotiated international agreements, sometimes choosing to ignore obvious fraud rather than disrupt important diplomatic relationships. The punishment systems that develop around marriage law enforcement reveal the practical difficulties of maintaining social control when large portions of the population regularly violate regulations they consider unjust or impractical. You observe church and civil authorities who implement increasingly severe penalties for marriage law violations, but find themselves unable to prosecute entire communities that unite in collective resistance to unpopular requirements. The Reformation impacts that emerge from widespread rule-breaking eventually force church authorities to acknowledge that their marriage laws have become so divorced from social reality that they require fundamental revision rather than stricter enforcement. You watch as the accumulation of violations and their social consequences gradually pressure religious authorities to modify canonical requirements that have proven unworkable in practice. The cultural variations in rule-breaking strategies reflect different regional approaches to authority and law that range from sophisticated legal manipulation to outright violent resistance depending on local traditions and political circumstances. You observe some communities that prefer subtle deception and bureaucratic manipulation, while others choose open defiance and armed resistance to marriage law enforcement. The economic impacts of widespread marriage law violations affect entire regional economies through their disruption of inheritance patterns, property transfers, and family business arrangements that depend on clear legal marriage status for proper functioning. You watch as uncertainty about marriage validity creates economic instability that sometimes forces authorities to provide retroactive legal amnesty for widespread violations. The social class differences in rule-breaking methods reveal how wealth and education affect the sophistication of the marriage law evasion strategies, with wealthy families employing professional legal assistance while poor couples rely on community support and crude deception techniques. You observe how different social groups develop distinct approaches to rule-breaking that reflect their available resources and risk tolerance. The psychological motivations driving marriage law violations range from genuine romantic love and family loyalty to calculated economic advantage and social climbing, creating complex moral landscapes where noble and selfish motivations often intertwine in ways that complicate simple judgments about right and wrong. The long-term consequences of widespread marriage law violations include gradual erosion of church authority, development of alternative legal systems, and eventual reformation of canonical marriage requirements that prove incompatible with social reality and human nature. You're witnessing the slow transformation of medieval marriage law through the accumulated pressure of individual resistance and collective non-compliance. You stand at the threshold between medieval and modern worlds, watching as ancient marriage customs slowly transform into traditions we still recognize today, their strange medieval origins now hidden beneath layers of romantic sentiment and cultural evolution that have obscured the practical, often harsh realities that created these enduring rituals. The morning light streams through stained glass windows of a contemporary church where brides still wear white, grooms still place rings on fourth fingers, and fathers still give away daughters in ceremonies that echo with medieval voices speaking across centuries of change. These aren't just quaint traditions, they're archaeological layers of human experience, each custom carrying forward the DNA of medieval marriage rules that once governed every aspect of human love with the authority of divine law. The white wedding dress that modern brides consider essential romantic symbolism traces its origins not to medieval purity concepts, but to Queen Victoria's 1840 wedding choice that transformed a practical garment into a symbol of romantic idealization. You observe how this relatively recent tradition replaced medieval customs where brides wore their finest existing clothes regardless of colour, often choosing rich fabrics in bold hues that demonstrated family wealth rather than symbolic purity. The medieval emphasis on displaying social status through wedding attire evolves into modern expectations about bridal appearance that still prioritize visual impact over practical considerations. The wedding ring traditions that contemporary couples assume have ancient romantic origins actually emerge from medieval legal requirements that transformed simple jewellery into binding contracts with supernatural significance. You watch as the circular shape representing eternity, the placement on the fourth finger because of imagined heart connections, and the metal choice indicating permanent value all derive from medieval attempts to create physical symbols for spiritual and legal commitments that most participants couldn't read or write. Modern ring ceremonies unknowingly reenact legal procedures designed to provide proof of valid marriages in societies where documentation was unreliable. The father giving away the bride reflects medieval property transfer customs that treated women as valuable assets moving between male-controlled family units. Though modern ceremonies disguise this economic reality beneath sentimental language about family blessing and emotional transition, you observe how contemporary fathers who proudly escort daughters down wedding aisles participate in ritualized property exchanges that once involved actual ownership transfers, dowry negotiations, and legal guardianship changes that gave husbands authority over wives' persons and possessions. The church wedding requirements that many modern couples consider religiously essential actually derive from medieval church attempts to control marriage for political and economic rather than spiritual purposes, with the sacred ceremony serving primarily to ensure canonical compliance and generate ecclesiastical revenue. You watch as contemporary religious wedding ceremonies preserve medieval power structures that once gave clergy authority over intimate relationships while collecting substantial fees for services that were originally designed to demonstrate church control rather than divine blessing. The honeymoon tradition that modern couples view as romantic escape originated in medieval practices that combined legal consummation requirements with practical considerations about establishing new households and demonstrating marital completion to community witnesses. You observe how contemporary honeymoons preserve medieval customs that once served to verify marriage validity and provide evidence of successful consummation, while allowing new couples to begin married life away from extended family interference and social pressure. The wedding invitation customs that govern modern celebrations derive from medieval banns reading requirements that gave communities opportunities to identify canonical violations and prevent invalid marriages through public disclosure of matrimonial intentions. You watch as contemporary invitation protocols preserve medieval community involvement expectations that once served legal notification purposes rather than social celebration objectives, with guest lists that originally functioned as witness pools for potential legal proceedings rather than party attendance rosters. The best man and maid of honour roles that modern weddings consider essential support positions actually derive from medieval witness requirements and protection services that ensured valid ceremonies while defending couples against family opposition or legal challenges. You observe how contemporary wedding parties preserve medieval customs where attendants served legal and military functions rather than emotional support roles, with groomsmen originally providing armed protection and bridesmaids offering testimony about brides' eligibility and consent. Historians still argue whether modern wedding traditions honour or betray medieval marriage values, and you can see evidence supporting both interpretations as contemporary ceremonies simultaneously preserve and transform ancient customs through romantic reinterpretation that obscures their practical origins while maintaining their ritual significance. Modern couples unknowingly participate in medieval legal procedures disguised as romantic celebrations. The wedding feast traditions that contemporary families consider celebratory requirements actually derive from medieval diplomatic customs that transformed marriage ceremonies into political events designed to demonstrate family alliances and social status through expensive displays that served strategic rather than romantic purposes. You watch as modern reception customs preserve medieval hospitality obligations that once functioned as political theatre and economic demonstration rather than simple party entertainment. The marriage vow formulations that modern couples recite as romantic promises actually preserve medieval legal language, designed to create binding contracts with specific canonical and civil implications that most contemporary participants don't understand or intend. You observe how, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, derives from medieval attempts to prevent annulment claims based on changed circumstances, creating legal obstacles to divorce that persist in modern romantic language. The wedding photography and documentation customs that contemporary couples consider memory preservation actually derive from medieval record-keeping requirements that served legal rather than sentimental purposes by providing evidence of valid ceremonies that might be needed for inheritance disputes or legitimacy challenges. You watch as modern wedding albums preserve medieval documentation traditions that once functioned as legal archives rather than family memorabilia. The gift-giving traditions that surround modern weddings reflect medieval dowry and bride price customs that have evolved into voluntary expressions of support while maintaining their fundamental character as resource transfers designed to help new families establish independent households. You observe how contemporary wedding registries preserve medieval practical focus on household establishment, while disguising economic necessity beneath voluntary generosity and consumer choice. The seasonal wedding preferences that create modern marriage timing patterns derive from medieval agricultural cycles and religious calendar restrictions that concentrated weddings during periods when food was available and church ceremonies were permitted. You watch as contemporary spring and summer wedding seasons preserve medieval practical considerations, while adding romantic interpretations about renewal and beauty that obscure the economic and canonical factors that originally determined wedding timing. The family involvement expectations that govern modern wedding planning reflect medieval kinship obligations that once served political and economic alliance functions rather than simple emotional support, with extended family participation preserving ancient customs that treated marriages as community events affecting broad social networks. You observe how contemporary family wedding roles maintain medieval collective investment principles while transforming political obligations into sentimental traditions. The legal documentation requirements that modern couples must complete before marriage ceremonies derive directly from medieval church and civil attempts to prevent canonical violations and ensure valid unions through bureaucratic procedures that contemporary participants often find tedious but historically essential. You watch as marriage license requirements preserve medieval legal protections, while simplifying complex canonical investigations into genealogy, previous marriages, and eligibility qualifications. The anniversary celebration customs that mark modern marriage milestones reflect medieval religious emphasis on marriage as sacramental commitment, requiring ongoing spiritual attention and community support rather than simple personal satisfaction. You observe how contemporary anniversary traditions preserve medieval concepts of marriage as public institution requiring periodic renewal and community recognition, rather than purely private relationship maintenance. The divorce law complexity that characterizes modern family courts derives directly from medieval canonical procedures that created elaborate legal frameworks for marriage dissolution while maintaining theological principles about marital permanence. You watch as contemporary divorce proceedings preserve medieval investigative procedures and evidentiary requirements while adapting canonical concepts to secular legal systems that maintain similar complexity and expense. The international marriage law variations that affect modern couples travelling or relocating between jurisdictions preserve medieval regional differences in marriage customs and legal requirements that created complex jurisdictional questions about marriage, validity and recognition. You observe how contemporary international marriage law maintains medieval precedents about territorial authority and legal recognition, while adapting ancient principles to modern global mobility. The cultural wedding fusion trends that characterize contemporary multicultural marriages preserve medieval patterns of cultural adaptation and synthesis that occurred when different ethnic and religious groups developed hybrid customs to accommodate competing traditional requirements. You watch as modern couples create blended ceremonies that echo medieval solutions to cultural conflicts, while adding contemporary emphasis on personal choice and individual expression. As you reflect on this journey through medieval marriage customs, you begin to understand how these ancient rules continue shaping modern relationships in ways we rarely recognize or acknowledge. The contemporary emphasis on romantic love as the primary basis for marriage represents a dramatic departure from medieval practical considerations. Yet our wedding ceremonies, legal frameworks, and cultural expectations preserve medieval structures that once served very different purposes than those we assign to them today. The echoes of medieval voices fade softly into the gentle rhythm of your breathing as you drift away from those ancient marriage halls where love and law danced their complex choreography across centuries of human longing. The candlelight grows dimmer now, and the rustling of parchment documents gives way to the whispered promises of night wind through your window. You've walked alongside countless couples who navigated impossible rules with courage and creativity, who found ways to honor both their hearts and their obligations in a world that often seemed designed to keep true love at arm's length. Let the weight of those ancient stones settle peacefully in your mind as you imagine the countless weddings that have blessed humanity across the generations, from nervous peasant ceremonies in village churches to elaborate royal pageantry in grand cathedrals. Each couple faced their own version of medieval marriage complexity, yet somehow love found its way through legal mazes and canonical restrictions, proving that human connection transcends even the most elaborate institutional barriers. The medieval world grows quiet around you now, its urgent negotiations and whispered conspiracies fading into the peaceful rhythm of your own heartbeat. Those ancient marriage rules that once seemed so strange and complicated have revealed their human heart, the eternal desire to create lasting bonds, to build families, to find companionship and meaning through shared life, even when surrounded by systems that seem to work against happiness. Rest peacefully now, knowing that love has always found a way, that human creativity and determination have always overcome artificial obstacles, and that the deep longing for connection that drove medieval couples to break rules and challenge traditions flows through your own veins as you settle into dreams where all marriages are blessed, all love is honoured, and all hearts find their way home to peace and contentment in the gentle embrace of sleep.